doctor sat in the room observing the patient, listening to the sounds of the rain drumming on the corrugated roof, barely drowning out the beeping of medical equipment. The patient had been brought in by a mysterious group of people that showed up in a helicopter landing on the beach. Now the patient lay on their table, moaning, barely conscious. They had told her that he had been in a construction accident, but none of the wounds that she saw seemed to match that kind of wound. She believed what she was seeing was an animal mauling. She grabs her camera and starts to catalog pictures of the wounds that she is seeing while having her assistant clean the wound. There's an acrid smell of rotting flesh on a wound that seems maybe only an hour old. It's covered in a sticky film saliva type substance that the doctor is not sure what it is. As she's thinking to herself, there's no way this is a construction accident. The patient bolts straight upright, bloodshot eyes, and starts to vomit blood before falling on the floor and violently shaking and convulsing, all the while continuing to spill up more and more blood before the twitches stop and the patient becomes stiff and draws his last breath. The doctor calls in the people who had brought him in, who quickly grab the body and take it with them. As she goes to look back at her camera, she notices that it's gone. The helicopter takes off in a whirl and flies off into the distance, never to be seen again. Later that night, the doctor is sitting in her home pondering something that the patient kept moaning over and over again. It was a word that her assistant didn't recognize as being any kind of Spanish word. Finally, she gets disturbed enough that she goes to her bookshelf and grabs her dictionary and looks up the word, the definition of which is a bird of prey or raptor. Hello, everyone. If that story sounded familiar to you, it's because it's from the opening pages of Michael Crichton's hit novel, Jurassic Park. Today, I want to kind of delve into this novel as it features some themes and even some lines in it that actually had a pretty big impact on me and what I decided I wanted to do with my life, which was not originally to make YouTube videos, but here we are. I also want to discuss something that I think is really lost when people talk about Jurassic Park. They're often referencing the film, which is great in its own right. It did a lot of amazing things for filmmaking as a whole, and it's just an excellently well-written film, but I think it misses a lot of the points that the novel really hits home. So today I want to be focusing on those. I'm going to go through the story of Jurassic Park, and then at the end, kind of give my 2 cents of what I think this novel was really about, and what Michael Crichton's point was in writing this in the first place. I want to thank you for being here, and I hope you're ready for what might be the greatest I told you so in all of fiction. And if that sounds good to you, let me bid you welcome to Jurassic Park. To begin our story, we first have to meet Dr. Marty Gutierrez, who is a researcher in Costa Rica who has been called in to identify the lizard bites found on a little girl on a beach there in Costa Rica. She had been brought into this doctor's office with tons of these little thumb-sized bites on her arms and legs. He meets the little girl and starts asking her parents how she described the lizard. And they give him this description. He's pretty sure that it's a basilisk lizard. He tells them very confidently that that's what this is and that there's not really anything to worry about. She should be able to go home in a couple of days. In order to kind of quell the worries of the parents, he says he will still send the saliva off to a lab to get tested. As they leave, the other doctor or physician who's been attending to this little girl, he asks her about this lizard, and she tells him that it had this really long tail and it stood on 2 legs like a chicken. It had 3 toes on its foot. It really confuses him because there's no 3-toed lizards in Costa Rica. The description that she gives, and she even draws a picture of it, that doesn't really match a basilisk lizard. Because of his suspicion, Marty decides that he's going to go down to the beach where she was attacked and see what he can find. Another reason that he's curious about doing this is, at this point, has been dozens of reports of little children like in their cribs or asleep at home being bitten by small lizards, and there's been this weird uptick in the last couple months, and he's not really sure why. So it's driven by this curiosity and the description given by Lisa Bowman, the little girl, that he goes to the beach. And he sits on this beach and he just watches and waits to try and see if he can find this lizard. He's looking for prints and he's not seeing anything. He's not hearing anything, and just as the sun is about to go down, he sees a howler monkey running along the beach with a lizard in its mouth. So he takes this tranquilizer gun that he'd brought with him, and he shoots the howler monkey, who drops this lizard in the ground and then runs off into the jungle. As he goes over and picks it up, he discovers what looks pretty similar to what she's described, and it's not a lizard he's ever seen, and it's certainly not anything that he knows to be native to Costa Rica. Although he's not super worried about it because Costa Rica has an abundancy of life that a lot of people don't even understand, and that there's new species being discovered or rediscovered all the time. So Gutierrez decides to send the lizard off to Edward Simpson, who is an expert in lizard identification in New York. Once it gets to New York, the lab technician that is doing samples and trying to figure out what kind of DNA it has, they're also the ones testing the saliva. And it comes back that it doesn't have any communicable diseases. There's nothing to worry about. But what they do find is there is a massive poison protein inside its saliva. And while that can be worrisome, they're not really worried about any diseases. Along with the specimen that he sent in this sealed canister, he also sent Tina Bowman's drawing, and the technician at the Simpson lab is looking over everything when another technician by the name of Alice Levine walks in, and as this guy is working there taking x-rays, looking at the images, Alice asks who drew the picture of the dinosaur. And the technician kind of scoffs and brushes her off, saying, "This isn't a dinosaur, it's a picture of a lizard that bit a little girl." Alice is like, "Well, I mean, trust me, I have little boys, and that looks like a dinosaur to me." The other technician continues to brush her off and says, "Nope, it's not a dinosaur. It's an unidentified lizard, and it's going to sit in the freezer until Simpson gets back." Everything would have been dropped there, except Alice decides to make a phone call. But we'll get to that. For now, we have to travel to just outside of Snakewater, Montana, a barren desert filled with crumbling limestone, and every step that you take is kicking up fine alkaline dust. There's no trees in sight to block out the harsh summer sun. This is no place for a man like Bob Morris, who, in his dress pants and button-down shirt, preferred to be in office settings, especially with air conditioning. This was no place for a man like him. However, it is exactly the place for Dr. Alan Grant. A barrel-chested and bearded man in his 40s, who was one of the premier paleontologists working in his field. Dr. Alan Grant was in the middle of uncovering what may be the first fully developed skeleton of a carnivore in his area. This is something that he's been hoping for a very long time, and as he's starting to uncover it, his assistant, Dr. Ellie Sadler, waves him in that there's a visitor. Alan Grant was not really a big fan of visitors. He really wasn't a big fan of most of the people in his field. He actually did a lot of work to kind of distance himself from what he viewed as really snotty paleontologists. He's doing things like giving lectures in Hawaiian shirts and jeans, and he refused to do interviews or write books when it was offered to him because he just wanted to dig. He was just dedicated to the science that he had. And he's described as this barrel-chested, bearded man in his 40s, again, wearing Hawaiian shirts and blue jeans. Just a blue-collar dino digger. The visitor that Grant and Ellie have at their dig site is Bob Morris, who is a lawyer for the EPA out of San Francisco, and he's coming to ask questions about this investigation that he's been doing on what's known as the Hammond Foundation. Now, the Hammond Foundation is one of the things that actually funds Grant and Ellie's dig, and that's why Morris is here. He's talking to all the researchers that are funded by the Hammond Fund to see if maybe there's a peculiar reason that they're getting the funding, or if Hammond asked them to give them any pieces of their research, just kind of understand what the relationship is. And their conversation goes a little bit like this. Bob Morris really has 3 or 4 fundamental questions for Grant. Why does the Hammond Foundation only fund cold weather digs? Which is ironic because they're in the middle of August in the hot summer sweltering sun. Why would this be considered a cold weather dig? Well, Morris shows Grant this map where all of the digs that the Hammond Foundation is funding are all in the northern hemisphere, all quite a ways north. One of the other big questions that Morris has for Grant is why Hammond is collecting amber. Amber is this solidified tree sap from prehistoric eras that's extremely hard. It has kind of this yellow hue to it, and Morris and the EPA are wondering why Hammond has so much of it. They've discovered that in the past couple years, he spent over $17 million on amber, and as far as they can tell, it has no real use. It has no defense use, and it has no commercial use, so why would anybody ever want to stockpile $17 million worth of this substance? He also brings up that it's really easily synthesized, so why go to all this effort? One of the other major questions that Morris has is actually about an island. He tells Grant that Hammond had leased an island off of the coast of Costa Rica and wasn't really sure why. It didn't seem like anybody from Costa Rica wanted the island because it's always covered in this haze. It's a partially volcanic island that, mixed with the colder weather from the sea, just creates this constant mist over the island. It's not really going to be any kind of resort area, and it's extremely hard to get to. He mentions that it takes up to 18 hours to get there from a boat and several hours to get there just on a helicopter, which is the only way to get to the island. So why does Hammond want it? And Grant kind of tells him he doesn't really know. He's not really sure what answer to give to any of these questions, and he'd never really even known about the island until Morris brings up that he was asked to consult about it, and Grant is kind of taken back by it because he doesn't recall any kind of consultation, but Morris comes with receipts and actually has a copy of the check that was written to Grant and asks him, well, do you remember this? Grant remembers that, yeah, they actually did ask him to consult. Grant had been asked to do this consultation because he was the first person to ever find a clutch of dinosaur eggs in Montana, and he also released a paper about the eating habits and nesting habits of hadrosaurs, and this made him a paleontological celebrity almost overnight. He's offered interviews and lectures and books, but he turns all of that down because he just wants to dig. And it's after he releases this paper that he is contacted by Donald Gennaro, a representative for Hammond. Gennaro asked Grant to provide any of the research that he had on these eating habits, and Grant tells Morris that Gennaro would call him in the middle of the night and be extremely flustered and anxious and needing to have answers to these questions right now, which didn't make a lot of sense to Grant. As far as he knew, all they were doing was creating a museum. He doesn't really know why they would need that information suddenly and in the middle of the night, but he kind of just goes along with it. But eventually, Grant gets kind of tired of all these calls coming from Gennaro, where he kind of calls the whole thing off. He takes the pay that they give him and goes about his business on the dig. The last question that Morris has to do with these computers that the EPA has found the Hammond Foundation purchasing. Apparently, the Hammond Foundation had been purchasing these supercomputers and just shipping them down to Costa Rica for no real apparent reason. The EPA can't figure out why they would want those down there, and the only conclusion that they can come to is that the biggest genetics lab in the world is being built on an island in Costa Rica, and they can't figure out why. The computers that they bought are for gene sequencing and can handle tons and tons, millions of bytes of data at a time, and it doesn't make any sense to the EPA, so that's why they're investigating all of this stuff. But one thing that does make sense to the EPA is why it's being done in South America, because South America has a lot less regulation on genetic research. Morris even brings up an incident that happened where this other genetics company called Biosin had created a rabies vaccine that featured a live version of rabies that could be contracted just by inhaling it, and they released it out into South America without telling anybody. Because the US didn't have any jurisdiction down there and there were no regulations in place, they just got away with it. As the conversation between Morris and Grant starts to wind down, Ellie goes to the back of the trailer to answer a ringing phone. Grant starts to walk Morris out of the trailer, and Morris asks him what else he thinks the Hammond Foundation could have used his research for, and Grant laughingly chuckles and tells him, well, they could feed a dinosaur. They both kind of chuckle, and Morris goes and he gets in his car and drives off. Just as he's driving off, Ellie and Grant are discussing their visitor before Grant turns to Ellie and asks, who was on the phone? Grant picks up the receiver, and on the other end is Alice Levine, who asks him if he can identify an X-ray of the body that she has in the New York lab. And with a doubtful chuckle, he requests that she send the fax over, but he's pretty certain that her identification is completely wrong. But as he holds the fax in his hand, it takes his breath away. Ellie and Grant kind of go back and forth discussing what they think this could be. They really narrow it down to two options. Either it's a fake, or it's a rediscovery. Now, if it's a fake, it's exceptionally good. One of the best that they've ever seen. One of the things about fakes, especially in paleontology, was they always showed you exactly what you were looking for, and that's kind of what they're seeing here. They also kind of determined that it's almost impossible to fake an X-ray. You almost have to be X-raying something that's real. On the other hand, if it's a rediscovery, that's almost impossible. The dinosaur, a Procompsognathus, died nearly 220 million years ago, and most rediscoveries were only recent additions to the fossil record, and were assumed to have died out within the last 10,000 years. So neither of these options are really possible, but before they can discuss it any further, the phone rings again. Grant answers the phone, and on the other end, as eccentric as ever, is John Hammond. He immediately starts complaining to Grant about being investigated by the EPA, and he asks him if anybody'd come by, which Grant tells him, as a matter of fact, Morris just left. Hammond is really frustrated by this, and he kind of steamrolls over any concerns that Grant might have, and invites Grant and Ellie to come to the island and do some more consulting, and he offers to pay them each $20,000 a day for the trip, which is enough money to fund their dig for several more seasons. They agree, and he gives them directions to the airport and hangs up. Not long after, it rings again. This time on the phone, somebody who Grant has not heard from since his initial consultation, Donald Gennaro. Gennaro exchanges pleasantries with Grant, and then he asks him about the Compy skeleton that had been sent to him. He asks if he actually has the specimen or just an X-ray. There's this weird air about, everybody asking about this specimen. It seems like they really want to get their hands on it, but we don't really know why. Gennaro tells Grant that he's glad that he's going to be going on the trip and that he will see him in a couple days, and hangs up. Just before making this phone call to Dr. Grant, Gennaro had actually been in a meeting with his boss, and they're discussing the trip as well. Gennaro, this stocky, muscular man in his 30s, had come to this kind of law firm that he's working at now after having a bit of a career in investment banking, and he was actually partially responsible for getting Hammond a lot of the funding for this new business that he started. Rather than accepting a bunch of money for fees, he just took a stock in the company, and that's why he's in this meeting with his boss, because his boss is kind of pissed that he did that. His boss is convinced that Hammond has been lying about all of this and is really trying to avoid this trip, but Gennaro and his law firm are forcing it on him, and Gennaro's boss wants to make sure that he gets all the information he needs before he can sign off yes or no on continuing this project. He also expresses that the investors in this company are very nervous because of the EPA's investigation into Hammond. So this trip that Grant and Ellie are actually being invited on is actually being forced onto Hammond by Gennaro. Now that he's got all the pieces in play, Gennaro can execute his plan. He is either going to have confirmation that this wildlife preserve in Costa Rica is going to go as planned, or he's going to shut it down. After this, we then cut to the next day where Donald Gennaro is sitting on a private jet across from the man who's caused him so much stress lately, John Hammond. And Gennaro is thinking about how long it's been since he's seen him, and all the thoughts and memories of this man kind of come flooding back into his mind as he sits there and looks at him. Gennaro's kind of asking himself how this man could be so advanced in age, in his late 70s, and yet be so childlike. He thinks about how kind of small he is, and while he's sitting on the plane, his feet are dangling over the seat like a little kid. He's also thinking about this constant desire that Hammond has to instill wonder in people. He remembers how Hammond had actually gone about getting funding originally for this new corporation that he's running called InGen. Fueled by his desire to get money from investors, but also to instill wonder in people, Hammond had actually paraded around what he called a genetically modified elephant. It was a little elephant that he carried around in a small cage. It was fully developed, but tiny. He hailed this as this genetic marvel, but Gennaro knew the truth that it didn't have anything to do with being genetic. The scientist who had created it basically just stunted its growth and then allowed it to develop fully, which is still impressive, but it was a lie that Hammond used in order to get funding. And the other thing that Hammond never tells anybody is that it is constantly sick. Hammond actually spent the good portion of half a decade constantly worried that this little elephant, his little moneymaker, was actually gonna die because it was sick constantly, it was getting infections, it would sneeze, and also that it had a really bad temper. People would actually get their fingers nibbled if they stuck their hands inside the cage, and also he was worried that it was gonna die and he wouldn't be able to replicate it because so far, it was the only one. Regardless of all these worries, Hammond raised over $870 million with this elephant and the help of Donald Gennaro. The other thing that Gennaro is thinking about as they're sitting there kind of having a little bit of a back and forth is how avoidant Hammond is. He was viewing this trip as kind of this leisurely vacation, not ever really confronting the fact that Gennaro was forcing him to do this basically at knife point, because if this doesn't go, the entire project's gonna get cut. And while they're on the plane, their conversation goes something like this. "It's too bad you didn't bring your family with you, Donald," he said. Gennaro shrugged. "It's my daughter's birthday. 20 kids already scheduled, the cake and the clown, you know how it is." "Oh, I understand," Hammond said. "Kids set their hearts on things." "Anyway, is your park ready for visitors?" Gennaro asked. "Well, not officially," Hammond said. "But the hotel is built, so there is a place to stay." "And the animals?" "Of course, the animals are all there, all in their places. I remember in the original proposal you were hoping for a total of 12. Oh, we're far beyond that. We have 238 animals, Donald." 238? The old man giggled, pleased at Gennaro's reaction. "You can't imagine it. We have herds of them." 238? How many species? 15 different species, Donald. That's incredible. That's fantastic. And what about the other things you wanted? The facilities, the computers? All of it. All of it. Everything on that island is state-of-the-art. You'll see it yourself, Donald. It's perfectly wonderful. That's why this concern is so misplaced. There's absolutely no problem with this island. Then there should be absolutely no problem with an inspection. And there isn't. But it slows things down. Everything has to stop for an official visit. You've had delays. Anyway, you've already postponed the opening. Oh, that. Hammond tugged the ragged silk handkerchief in his pocket of his sports coat. It was bound to happen, bound to happen. Why? Well, Donald, to explain that, you have to go back to the initial concept of the resort. The concept of the most advanced amusement park in the world, combining the latest electronic and biological technologies. I'm not talking about rides. Everybody has rides. Coney Island has rides. And these days, everybody has animatronic environments. The haunted house, the pirate den, the Wild West, the earthquake. Everyone has these things. So we set out to make biological attractions, living attractions. Attractions so astonishing, they would capture the imagination of the entire world. Gennaro had to smile. It was almost the same speech, word for word, that he had used on the investors so many years ago. And we can never forget the ultimate object of this project in Costa Rica, to make money, Hammond said, staring out the windows of the jet. Lots and lots of money. I remember. And the secret to making money in the park is to limit your personnel costs. Your food handlers, ticket takers, cleanup crews, repair teams, to make a park that runs with minimal staff. That is why we invested in all this computer technology, to automate wherever we could. I remember. But the plain fact is, when you put together all the animals and all the computer systems, you run into snags. Whoever got a major computer system up and running on schedule? Nobody I know. So you've just had normal startup delays? Yes, that's right. Normal delays. I heard there were accidents during construction. Some workmen died. Yes, there were several accidents, and a total of 3 deaths. 2 workers died building the skiff road. 1 other died as a result of an earth mover accident in January. But we haven't had any accidents for months now. Put his hand on the younger man's arm. Donald, believe me when I tell you that everything on this island is going forward as planned. Everything on the island is perfectly fine. With this, the jet starts to land to pick up Dr. Grant and Dr. Sadler, thus ending our introduction to John Hammond. So what have we learned so far with this character, right? I mean, he's the insider of all the things that happen in this novel. He's the one who set everything up. Well, for one, it seems like he is extremely confident in his planning and the technology that he's built this park on. He has a desire for money, that being the point of him building this park. He's not very willing or open to hear any kind of criticisms. We see the things where he's complaining about, oh, everybody has rides, but we have biological attractions. He wants to create wonder. He wants to be the only one to do it. He also wants to keep everything a little bit secret, but we'll learn a bit more of that a little bit later. After picking up Dr. Grant and Ellie, the plane takes off to Dallas, Texas, where they pick up who's, in my opinion, the greatest character in the novel and kind of the stand-in for Michael Crichton himself, and someone who doesn't dress too terribly, Dr. Ian Malcolm. Dr. Malcolm is another doctor who consulted for Hammond when he was first thinking about building the park, only rather than being a paleontologist, he's a mathematician, and he studies what is known as chaos theory, which is used to explain really complex systems. And we'll get to see more of his thoughts and how he kind of views everything later on in the story. But at this point, all we need to know is he acts very, very antagonistically towards Hammond. He believed from the very beginning that this was going to fail, and he dresses like a rock star in all black. He even says the only colors he wears are black or gray because he thinks that there's nothing more boring than fashion, and he'd rather be interested in something more complex. This antagonism towards Hammond is shown right off the bat, as the first words that he says when he gets on the plane are, "Hello, John. Yes, I'm afraid your old nemesis is here. Also, I will be pretending that I am Malcolm throughout this story, so my voice for him in the novel is going to be fairly similar to how I talk now." When he first gets on the plane, he immediately does introductions with everybody. He shakes Grant's hand and says, "Hi, I do maths." Immediately starts hitting on Dr. Sadler, as we could imagine he would, of someone who acts and dresses like him. And he sits down and starts to kind of explain what it is he studies, which is chaos theory. And the two big things that chaos theory does and that Malcolm studies is complex systems actually have this kind of level of underlying order to them, and that simple systems actually have a ton of complexity to them. Really small effects can lead to extremely unpredictable behavior in very simple systems. And when discussing chaos theory as it applies to this wildlife preserve on the island, when talking to Gennaro, he says this: "And Hammond's project is another apparently simple system. Animals within a zoo environment. That will eventually show unpredictable behavior. You know this because of theory," Malcolm said. "But hadn't you better see the park? See what's actually done?" "No, that's quite unnecessary. The details don't matter. Theory tells me that the island will quickly proceed to behave in an unpredictable fashion. And you're confident of your theory." "Oh yes, totally confident." He sat back in his chair. "There's a problem with this island. It's an accident waiting to happen. And little do they know that a problem is already taking shape in the form of a man named Lewis Dodson. Lewis Dodson is the head of product management for the company Biosyn, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, and he's actually the one who's in charge of the rabies virus that was sent out into South America without any warning. The novel actually states that he was removed from Johns Hopkins for trying to do experiments with medication on test subjects without the FDA's approval, and he believes that Hammond is making these creatures and is going to patent his designs so that he's able to mass produce them and be the only one who can sell them. So Dodson wants to get his hands on it before the patents can go through to create their own version and reverse engineer whatever it is that they have. And it's this desire that has brought him to the San Francisco airport, where he is meeting with a disgruntled InGen employee. Their meeting goes relatively well. Dodson notices that every time he's met with this employee, he becomes more and more brash and less careful about this corporate espionage that they're engaging in, while Dodson takes it seriously, almost as if he's a spy. And the employee points this out to him, but Dodson doesn't really care. He just wants to get his hands on these embryos from Hammond's Island and is willing to do whatever it takes to get it. And he shows this employee the money that he's willing to pay, and they formulate their plan for Dodson to get a hold of this DNA. So Dodson and this employee have their plan set. Dodson is willing to pay him the $50,000 per species embryo that's viable, and he gives him this special little canister that he can use to get it through airport security, something that in the book he says his engineers spent hours developing in order to get it to this guy. And he gives him this thing, and the plan is set, and they part ways. While all this has been going on, our consultation group has landed in Costa Rica and are taking a helicopter over to the island. And as they go to land through all the mist and everything, they land on their helipad and are met by Ed Regis, the park's public relations manager, who explains a little bit about the island. He tells them it's a 22-foot square mile island that was made by volcanic activity underground, which means it's got these hot steam vents where the ground is very consistently warm, and it's that mixed with the current causes all of the mist that's always in the air. And he also explains that although it's mostly tropical, there is a little bit of rainforest similar to what you find in the Pacific Northwest. And as they're talking about these trees, Grant looks down the path from where the helicopter pad is and sees a tree with no leaves on it. And as he's staring at it, it turns and starts staring at him, because what he is looking at is a live Apatosaurus. Yes, this is our first clear guarantee that we are looking at a dinosaur. And it is described as being enormous. It's the size of a house. They all stand together in groups and make these trumpeting sounds like elephants. One of the things that Grant notices that is completely against everything that his field of thought is, they're extremely graceful and quick. They're not the big lumbering dinosaurs that everybody thinks of. Everybody in the group has a different reaction to seeing these dinosaurs. Grant starts to feel really dizzy and he has trouble catching his breath. And in his head, he starts just answering all these questions that have been in the field that he's worked in for decades. And at one point, he just begins to laugh, like uncontrollably, because all of the things that have just been theory at this point, he can now prove as true or false. He also laughs because they remind him a little bit of giraffes. Gennaro, on the other hand, is completely speechless. He is absolutely blown away by seeing the power of this technology that Hammond has. And at this point, in Gennaro's mind, it's all been theory and speculation, and now he gets to see it living and breathing. And he thinks to himself, we're gonna make a killing on this place, and he hopes to God that the park is safe. Ellie is just surprised by how graceful they are, and she just keeps repeating, my God, which, fair enough. Malcolm, on the other hand, being the guy who he is and always wanting to kind of take the piss out of everything, just asks Ed Regis if they're animatronic, and he's really the only one who's like not at all flabbergasted by the fact that he's looking at a dinosaur. He just immediately starts making jokes about it. I love him. He's my favorite. As they're making their way down to the visitor center, Malcolm starts asking Grant a bunch of questions, and Grant says, like, this changes everything about his field. Like, paleontology is based on a lot of speculation, and now that they have a living dinosaur, there's not really much to speculate. Malcolm kind of says, like, oh, well, you don't seem really concerned or worried. Grant shook his head. It's been discussed in the field. Many people imagined it was coming, but not so soon. Story of our species, Malcolm said, laughing. Everybody knows it's coming, but not so soon. As Grant and Malcolm are having their discussion, Ellie, she's a paleobotanist. She recognizes a plant that's placed outside the visitor center right next to the pool. She recognizes it as being extremely toxic, and that if a little kid accidentally ate some of it, it would almost certainly kill them. And that's going to be a little bit of a theme that we see here, where some of the planning that's put in is not put in with the right amount of thought, but we'll get to more of that later. It is at this point that they go down to the lodge where they're going to see the rooms that they're going to be staying in, and when Grant gets to his, he notices how unfinished it is. There's like materials all over the floor, and he finds like scrap pieces of wiring in the closet, and he tries to turn on the TV, but it's nothing but static. He also notices on the skylight that's above his bed, there's like these really thick metal bars that look like they were fairly hastily put in, and he makes note of it, but doesn't really understand why that would need to be there. He also notices that the doors and window frames are like steel clad and heavily framed. He even mentions to Ellie that it seems like they're in a fortress. He also notices a 12-foot high steel fence with pieces that are over an inch thick running in between the fence posts. And he just kind of makes a note of it, but then moves on as they head into the visitor center to start their tour, where Gennaro reminds them that the reason for their visit is not to have fun, but to critique and make sure that the park is actually safe. Gennaro also brings up the Compy skeleton in New York and all the lizard bites in Costa Rica, and Malcolm, well, he's got a theory about that. He believes that animals have already gotten off of the island and says that the goal was to create this isolated natural place, but it's not even possible for zoos to fully accomplish that. And when explaining his theory, he says this: "Well, it's very simple. Except for the air, which flows freely, everything about this park is meant to be isolated. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. The animals kept here are never to mix with the greater ecosystem of Earth. They are never to escape." "And they never have," Hammond snorted. "Such isolation is impossible," Malcolm said flatly. "It simply cannot be done." "It can, it's done all the time." "I beg your pardon, but you don't know what you're talking about." "You arrogant little snot," Hammond said. He stood and walked out of the room. "I'm sorry, but the point remains. What we call nature is in fact a complex system of far greater subtlety than we are willing to accept. We make a simplified image of nature and then we botch it up. I'm no environmentalist, but you have to understand what you don't understand. How many times must the point be made? How many times must we see the evidence? We built the Aswan Dam and claim it is going to revitalize the country. Instead, it destroys the fertile Nile Delta, produces parasitic infestation, and wrecks the Egyptian economy. We built the... Malcolm is then cut off by a helicopter arriving on the island, and everybody goes outside to meet Tim and Lex, the kid characters of this story. Tim and Lex are both John Hammond's grandchildren. Tim is an 11-year-old who, as we'll come to see, is a dinosaur fanatic. Lex is the granddaughter who likes sports, and as we will also learn, is annoying as hell. They kind of changed places in the film and made both of them a little bit less annoying, but she's annoying throughout this entire book, and you will see why. As the group goes out to the helicopter pad to meet Tim and Lex, though, Gennaro gets in an argument with Hammond about the fact that these kids should not be on the island, and Gennaro is just pissed at Hammond for treating this like it's some kind of vacation or walk in the park. So Gennaro's annoyed by this. Ed Regis is also really annoyed that instead of doing public relations, he's basically being a babysitter and a tour guide because he's put in charge of watching Tim and Lex throughout the entire afternoon. Hammond really shuts down the argument with Gennaro and says that he doesn't want to argue in front of the kids, and they move on to the facility tour that Ed Regis leads, and Regis takes them by the control center where they see dozens of computer monitors, and they're all being looked over by John Arnold, who is the engineer, and Robert Muldoon, the game warden for the park, but we'll meet them more later. For now, we're going to meet the character that is responsible for the creation of all these animals, Dr. Henry Wu. Regis takes them into the extractions part of the facility where they meet Dr. Henry Wu, the lead scientist and geneticist of Jurassic Park. And Wu kind of takes them through the process of how they are able to extract the DNA that they use for creating these animals from bone fragments and the giant stockpile of amber that I mentioned earlier. He also mentions how they use the supercomputers to basically figure out the gene structures and sequence the genes that they find within the DNA. He also talks about how the gaps that are found within the DNA are found by the computer and fixed either by the computer or manually by a scientist. He talks about how with this kind of ancient DNA that they have, there's only a couple differences between one animal and another, and that's how they actually identify them, is by the differences, rather than the long gene sequence. And the way that they discover what kind of DNA it is in the animal is they either guess based on where on the evolutionary chain it falls, or they just grow it and see what it hatches into. While they're going through this tour and Wu is explaining all of this kind of really heavy scientific stuff, Tim Murphy notices a sloppy, fat man in the back of the group who seems completely uninterested in everything that he's saying, and he finds out that this is Dennis Nedry, the head computer engineer. Dennis Nedry was hired to create a record-keeping system for the park, which he was never actually told what it was being used for, just the size and scale parameters that he needed to design for. And as anybody who's ever worked on computers will tell you, that is not a very good way to build a system. And it took him over a year to create this system for the park, and Hammond had called him down in an absolute panic because there are bugs everywhere. We learned that there's a list over like 130 pages of errors in this system. And Nedry believes that it's all due to the fact that Hammond wouldn't tell him what he was building and what it was being used for. Just build a computer. I can't tell you what it's for. And that's why he's here, is to fix these bugs, but he is completely uninterested in this stupid tour. And Tim is starting to get that way too, until they get into the hatchery. Now, when they get in the hatchery, they notice a couple things. For one, it's like 100 degrees in the room, and Wu explains that it's at 100% humidity and a 30% oxygen concentration because they're trying to create a prehistoric environment for these eggs to grow and hatch in. And the entire room is covered in this heavy mist, and there's these infrared lights that shine down, as well as technicians that go around and kind of rotate the eggs every so often. Wu explains that they only have a survival rate of about 4%. And while going through this, Tim notices that there is a little section in the very back of the room that has these blue lights and a skull and crossbones on it. And Wu explains that they have the most toxic poisons on the planet because they need it in order to stop mitosis at like the perfect point when creating these animals. And then after the hatchery, they go into the nursery and see a tiny, few-week-old velociraptor. When they're in the nursery with this little baby dinosaur, that Wu explains that all the animals in the park were introduced by them and had spent time in the nursery because they're not able to breed. They are all female, and all of the reproductive organs have been zapped before releasing them into the park. Wu also explains that he's made them lysine dependent, which is an amino acid that the body needs to produce in order to function, and by making them unable to produce it, they have to get it in a tablet form, which means if they ever escape the park, they're not able to survive, and they would just go into a coma and die within like 12 hours. It is also in the nursery that Grant's curiosity kind of takes hold of him, and he starts to examine the raptor, and this is how that goes. Grant came over and peered critically at the creature. He touched the tiny three-clawed hand. He said to Tim, "Do you mind?" And Tim released the raptor into his hands. Grant flipped the animal onto its back, inspecting it, while the little lizard wiggled and squirmed. He then lifted the animal high to look at its profile, and it screamed shrilly. "She doesn't like that," Regis said. "Doesn't like to be held away from the body contact." The raptor was screaming, but Grant paid no attention. Now he was squeezing the tail, feeling the bones. Regis said, "Dr. Grant, if you please. I'm not hurting her." "Dr. Grant, these creatures are not of our world. They come from a time where no human beings around to prod and poke them." "I'm not prodding and Dr. Grant, put her down," Ed Regis said. "But now." Regis was starting to get annoyed. Grant handed the animal back to Tim. It stopped squealing, and Tim could feel its little heartbeat beating rapidly against its chest. "I'm sorry, Dr. Grant," Regis said, "but these animals are delicate in infancy. We have lost several from a postnatal stress syndrome which we believe is adrenocortically mediated. Sometimes they die within 5 minutes." Tim petted the little raptor. "It's okay, kid," he said. "Everything's fine now." The heart was still beating rapidly. "We feel it is important that the animals be treated in the most humane manner," Regis said. "I promise you that you will have plenty opportunity to examine them later." But Grant couldn't stay away. He again moved toward the animal in Tim's arms, peering at it. The little velociraptor opened her jaws and hissed at Grant in a posture of sudden intense fury. "Fascinating," Grant said. "Can I stay and play with her?" Tim said. "Not right now," Ed Regis said, glancing at his watch. "It's 3 o'clock. It's a good time for a tour of the park itself, so you can see all the dinosaurs and habitats we have designed for them." Tim released the velociraptor, which scampered across the room, grabbed a ragged cloth, put it in her mouth, and tugged at the end with her tiny claws. They leave the main building and travel outside to where there is a velociraptor pen, and they're watching, and as they're walking around the pen, they see a little head off in the distance, and it's just staring at them. And they're staring back at it, and as that happens, two other velociraptors rush forward and jump to attack them, and they end up hitting the fence, which explodes in this like burst of sparks, and the animals end up running off into the distance. Malcolm and Grant discuss that they act like pack hunters, and he's surprised that they're willing to try and attack them if the fence is there. In the discussion that Malcolm and Grant are having, Malcolm kind of mentions that tigers and lions don't really become man-eaters until they discover how easy humans are to kill. Malcolm poses the question to Grant, how did these dinosaurs figure out that humans were easy to kill, that they would attack us? After their little side quest over to the velociraptor pen, they are taken into the control room to see the computer system that basically runs the entire park. They're introduced to the tracking system that the park uses in order to see where all the animals are and to count the number of animals in the park. They're shown that the system automatically, through motion tracking and cameras, calculates the number of dinosaurs that are in the park. They also see how the camera tracking works and how the computer system can switch back and forth between multiple different cameras. They're shown a lot of technical stuff about how the park functions and tracks the animals, and they're shown this kind of distribution of the size of the compy population, and it's this kind of normal distribution that you would see, and Malcolm thinks that that's ridiculous. There's no way they could possibly have that because that's what you would see in a natural environment, and Malcolm again is attesting that this isn't a natural environment, that this is a zoo, and even that is not a natural environment. But they're not really able to go any deeper into that because they're about to start the park tour. Everybody goes outside where they are greeted by two electrical SUVs, or Land Cruisers as they're referred to, and they all run on this electrical rail like a train, and Ed Regis explains that they're built by Toyota and that they run on electricity because it's part of the park's non-polluting policy. And this is where the famous line that they spared no expense comes in. They split into two different groups. They have Tim, Lex, and Ed Regis in one vehicle, and then Gennaro, Ellie, Grant, and Malcolm all go into another. They leave off for the tour, and it is on this tour where they all experience the wonder of Jurassic Park, and they have automatic CD-ROMs in the vehicles that explain the different animals, and Ed Regis himself also explains them both to the kids in the car, but also to the other vehicle via a two-way radio system that they have set up. And they pass all kinds of different animals. They pass a group of, I know I'm going to say this wrong, hypsilophodonts that have an itch because of an unknown skin disease. In the distance, they see the aviary, which is an unfinished part of the park at this point. And then they see a Dilophosaurus, which, to be a 10-year-old again, is one of the coolest dinosaurs ever. They see them by the river, and they're described as being these 10-foot tall bipedal dinosaurs with these strong hind legs and a really thick tail and this long neck. They're a spotted yellow and black. They almost look like a lizard version of a leopard. One of the coolest features of them that makes them so distinct is they have these two red crests that run the entire length of the back of their head, and as they're driving by, the video explains that they hoot like an owl. They're a dinosaur that just sounds like an owl. Another thing that they learned from the video is they spit acid because why not? The video explains that the poison that they spit causes blindness and paralysis, and they're just like, yeah, I mean, why not? Throw that in the park. We later learned that they actually like spit through the fences, and there's a reason that the vehicle windows don't roll down. Which is like, I don't know, you could have not put a poisonous dinosaur, but like, whatever. They also pass by a Triceratops, which the video says that the animals are nearsighted and will charge vehicles, but not their handlers. Like, somehow they have already started to like recognize the humans that are around them all the time, and they won't charge them, but they will charge a vehicle. I don't know if it's that they're intimidated or the sizing, but they explain that they had to paint the vehicles a certain way so that the dinosaur wouldn't charge them. And as they're continuing on the tour, the adults in one vehicle are continuing to have a conversation. Regis and the video are continuing to talk about the tour. They kind of come to the crest of this hill. It's this beautiful, pristine view as the sun kind of starts to go down. But they're looking out south, and in the distance, they see kind of down the hill, they see this little lagoon. And even further past that, they see apatosaurs, and it's quiet except for cicadas, but there's no sign of the animal that they're supposed to be seeing. And that animal is the T-Rex. Regis explains that the T-Rexes can't mix with the other animals, and that they're surrounded by this electrical fence, as well as a moat that would keep them from crossing should the fence not work. And they're kind of sitting there, they're watching this scene, they're listening to the cicadas, but there's no sign of the T-Rex. In order to bait the T-Rex out, they see a goat suddenly rise up from the ground on this platform, and it's on a chain, and it's just kind of sitting there, and it's chained to this, and they just sit there and they wait. And the adults are kind of just talking, discussing what they think about a T-Rex and that they really want to see it. Malcolm asks if the T-Rex is shy, and Regis explains that it doesn't like the sun because it can get sunburnt, which is like, okay, like biggest predator in the world is hurt by a sunburn. All right. But as they're sitting there and they're waiting and they're discussing these things, all of a sudden the goat starts to bleat and pull on the chain, and it's trying to break free, but they still don't see anything. Suddenly, they are overcome by a putrid smell. It's described as smelling like a garbage can and just the putrid smell of decay. And they're looking around and they still can't find this dinosaur, but then they realize that they're looking too low. As they start to look up above the trees and the leaves, they see that the T-Rex's head is 20 feet in the air, and it's described as having this square head that's over 5 feet long, and it's this molted reddish brown color. And they see it, and it's just staring. It's just staring at the goat that's trying to escape. And then suddenly, in a couple of quick lunges, it comes fast and it kills the goat. But then it just waits there. The goat's dead. It's laying on the ground, and the dinosaur is just staring at it, almost like it's being cautious. And Grant explains that with a lot of predators like that, these bigger predators, they put a lot of effort into killing something and then become extremely cautious because they're afraid that something else is going to come and steal it. And that's exactly what this is doing with this dinosaur. And eventually it starts eating the goat in front of them, which Lex is completely grossed out by, and eventually he gets paranoid, grabs the rest of the goat, and runs off into the trees. That's their introduction to the T-Rex. After witnessing the T-Rex kill, they continue down the sloped hill, and they come to a lagoon, and they see brontosaurs. And Ed Regis explains to Lex that brontosaurs are the biggest dinosaurs to ever exist, and Tim is sitting there thinking to himself, no, they're not. And Tim, although he doesn't correct him, he knows that he's wrong and that brachiosaurs are bigger. Something we learn about Tim is that he's kind of dinosaur obsessed. He's a huge dinosaur fanatic. And one thing I forgot to mention is when he actually met the group of adults after landing the helicopter, he realized that he recognizes Dr. Grant because he has his book. But while this is going on, they start to notice some storm clouds start to form in the back, and there's a thought that it's going to start raining. And as they're kind of discussing this possibility and continuing to move, there's a flash of pale yellow in a field by the apatosaurs, and Tim thinks it's a velociraptor, but Ed Regis tells him that there's no way that's possible because all the velociraptors are in their main pen, kind of just shuts it all down and says, there's no way that that's what it is, you're wrong. And as they continue their tour, they continue to go further south into the island, and they come to an area that's got a ton of different volcanic activity, and they see one of the jeeps that is owned by the park, and they see Dr. Harding, the veterinarian, is attending to a stegosaurus that is sick. At this point, everybody gets out and goes and talks to Dr. Harding. One of the things that Harding brings up to Ellie is that he can't figure out why the dinosaur is sick, and they start kind of going back and forth discussing the different things that it could be. Ellie thinks that they had to have eaten something poisonous, but Harding explains that, well, it only happens every 6 weeks, so it doesn't make sense that that would happen. Ellie and Grant go over and they see these like weird piles of smooth stones that are covered in these toxic berries. And what they learn is that just like birds, the dinosaurs have gizzard stones. And if you're not super familiar with how birds function, their stomachs aren't like ours where they fully digest their food just with the muscles of their stomach. They have what is called a gizzard. It's a small pouch that they fill with little rocks or pebbles depending on the size of the bird, and they swallow those, and then when they swallow their food and move around, the rocks help grind the food and almost pre-digest it before it moves to the stomach. And they find out that that's what the dinosaurs are doing. And on these gizzard stones are these poisonous plant berries, and they determine that that's what makes them sick. And while they're dealing with the Stegosaurus, Gennaro, again, is asking more questions of Dr. Malcolm to explain his theory. And Malcolm tells him that chaos theory originally came out in response to computers being created in order to try and predict the weather. In this kind of rant that he has, he says, theory throws it right out the window. It says that you can never predict certain phenomenon at all. You can never predict the weather more than a few days away. All the money that has been spent on long-range forecasting, about $500 million in the past few decades, is money wasted. It's a fool's errand. It's as pointless as trying to turn lead into gold. We look back at the alchemists and laugh at what they were trying to do, but future generations will laugh at us the same way. We've tried the impossible. We spent a lot of money doing it, because in fact there are great categories of phenomenon that are inherently unpredictable. Chaos says that? Yes, and it's astonishing how few people care to hear it. I gave all the information to Hammond long before he broke ground on this place. You're gonna engineer a bunch of prehistoric animals and set them on an island? Fine. A lovely dream, charming, but it won't go as planned. It is inherently unpredictable, just as the weather is. You told him this. Yes, I told him where the deviations would occur. Obviously, the fitness of the animals on the environment was one area. This Stegosaurus is 100 million years old. It isn't adapted to this world. The air is different, the solar radiation is different, the land is different, the insects are different, the sounds are different, the vegetation is different. Everything is different. The oxygen concentration is decreased. This poor animal's like a human being at 10,000 feet altitude. Listen to him wheezing. And the other areas? Broadly speaking, the ability of the park to control the spread of life forms. Because the history of evolution is that life escapes all barriers, life breaks free, life expands to new territories, painfully, perhaps even dangerously. But life finds a way. I don't mean to be philosophical, but there it is. And this is where Malcolm's famous "life finds a way" monologue happens. It's far from the best monologue in here, but we'll get to that. But first we have to deal with something that happens while Gennaro and Malcolm are having this discussion. Grant discovers what he believes is the broken piece of a velociraptor egg. Before we get to that, I have to back up just a little bit. The entire time during this tour, Hammond has been in the control room with John Arnold, the chief engineer, and Robert Muldoon, the game warden for the park, kind of watching their progress. And while he's been in the control room, he has been getting in arguments with both of these men. John Arnold, again the chief engineer, is somebody that Hammond believes is like this constant worrier. He was somebody who previously worked on the Polaris missile system for the US Navy. He was previously an engineer for Disney when they built the Orlando resort, and he's worked on all these different engineering parks and systems, and Hammond thinks that he's got this real negative view of everything, when in reality, Arnold is just looking at the problems and seeing them where they occur. It's even shown in these like little small things. When they first start the tour, Arnold points out that the gears are grinding in the transmissions of the electric vehicles and that they'll need to be checked on. Hammond kind of like disregards this as this like little minor incident, but Arnold kind of tells him like, there are no minor issues. This is the most ambitious park that's ever been built. All issues are major issues because they could lead to much bigger problems. And he argues with Hammond saying like, you are in a very unique situation here. You have all the problems of a major theme park in automation and the electrical rides, but now you also have all the major problems of a zoo, feeding and caring for animals that no one has ever done before. This is worse than a regular zoo because you're not just caring for animals that everybody knows about and there's science out on how to take care of them. These are animals nobody has ever taken care of, and that can lead to problems. And he just continually fights and pushes back against Hammond because it seems like Hammond doesn't see any of the problems and Arnold sees all of them. And on the side of talking about the animals, one of the big things that Arnold advocates for is that the velociraptors are too dangerous to be kept, and Muldoon absolutely agrees. Muldoon is described as being in his 50s. He's a really burly man with this big, thick, steel gray mustache, and he absolutely agrees and actually takes it a step further, and he believes that the velociraptors should absolutely be destroyed. He's got a little bit of ground to stand on because he came to the park as an animal and wildlife consultant. It's something that he'd done in multiple zoos and theme parks around the world before, but long before that, he was born and raised in Kenya, and he grew up basically giving tours and as a hunting guide on the dangerous game of Africa, and he understands not just predators, but all animals at the park more than probably anybody. And on that subject, he knows more about these animals than anybody, but he's still very mad at the management because he doesn't know as much as he should, and management's getting in the way of that. I mentioned that the Dilophosaurs spit poison. Well, that wasn't something that anybody knew about until it actually happened to a worker, and they actually tried to stop them and figure out how to remove the poison sacs, but nobody knew where it was being excreted from. Muldoon insisted that they do an autopsy on an animal to figure out where it is so that they can take the poison out, and management said no, because the animals are too valuable. We can't kill an autopsy one. So, I mean, understandably, he's upset about that. But the thing that upsets him even more is the lack of weapons. He told Hammond from the very beginning that they needed to have enough weaponry to combat anything that might happen on the park, whether it be an animal getting out or an animal attacking a worker when they were doing routine maintenance or any kind of veterinary care on the animal. But Hammond refused. He said that the animals were too valuable, and Muldoon says that you wouldn't allow me to get these things because you didn't want to harm your precious animals. And while Hammond is having this argument with Muldoon, he turns to Nedry, who's working on the computer system, and goes to yell at him, and Arnold stops him because he knows if he starts a fight with Nedry, it's only gonna get worse, and that Nedry is not going to take well to being antagonized while he works. Even though Arnold recognizes not to antagonize Nedry, he doesn't like him either. In fact, one of the things that Arnold is really upset with Nedry about is that the security in the park turns off if main power is lost and doesn't come back on with auxiliary power. But fairly enough, Nedry's not really happy with any of these problems either. He originally thought that he could fix these problems himself, but once he actually got to the island, he realized that the problems were way, way worse than he had been led to believe, and now he's gonna have to spend his entire weekend, probably more, working full-time to fix all the issues. It's so bad, in fact, that he actually has to call his team on the mainland and tell them that they're gonna have to work constantly over the weekend in order to fix these issues, and he sets up a data transfer using the phone lines to get all of the coding sent out so his team can work on fixing it. And while all of these arguments are going on in the control room, they are listening to the radio of the people talking in the vehicles, and they listen to Gennaro and Malcolm and Grant discussing what would happen if the T-Rex escaped. And this really pisses off Hammond because he's just mad that everybody is being so negative and that they're not overwhelmed by the wonder of the entire situation. And it also makes Wu angry because he feels insulted that these people would insinuate that he would participate in something that could go wrong. He's such a good scientist. He would never get involved with a project that could have issues, and he's insulted by what they're saying. But Arnold eventually kind of diffuses all of these arguments by just telling everybody to calm down and just see how the tour continues to go. And after Tim sees what he thinks is the Velociraptor, everyone in control is wondering what it could have been. And as they're kind of discussing what they think it could be, they're cut off by radio transmission from the dock because the supply boat that has to bring supplies every 2 weeks is trying to leave before this big storm comes in. And Hammond states that he doesn't want them to leave. He wants them to continue offloading stuff because he needs the supplies that they have. But Arnold argues with Hammond that they didn't build a strong enough dock for that boat to stay there, and if they don't let the boat leave and it's smashed on the dock, they're going to have a worse problem. So reluctantly, Hammond allows the ship to leave, and it takes off. And it's very shortly after this that Command hears over the radio that Harding and Ellie have solved the Stegosaurus problem, but also that Grant believes he's found the Velociraptor egg. Hammond absolutely refuses to believe this, telling Grant that there's no way possible and continuing to look back at Dr. Wu like the dinosaurs can't breathe, right? And Wu is extremely confident in his science and reaffirms yes. But Malcolm over the radio isn't having it, and he tells Arnold to do the search parameters for the automatic tracking of the dinosaurs. So he does it, and they get the result 238 out of 238. Exactly what they always have. And Hammond kind of snuffs at him and says, "See, you were wrong." But Malcolm has another idea, so he has Arnold run the numbers, except this time change the parameters. Instead, set it to 300 animals. So Arnold does this, and the counter starts to go up, and it goes up and up and up, until finally the final counter is 292 animals rather than 238. And while Hammond and Wu are kind of flabbergasted by this, Arnold understands why. They were just asking the computer to show them what they wanted to see, what they expected, and that's what the computer gave them rather than giving them what was true. And the group decide that they're gonna come back to the visitor center, they're gonna look at the data, and they're gonna try to come up with a plan on finding the nests of these dinosaurs that are breeding in the wild to get true confirmation that that's what's happening. So they head back to the visitor center. Grant and Malcolm get in the rear car this time because Tim and Lex want to be at the front. They're still with Regis. However, Gennaro and Ellie decide to stay with Harding and the Stegosaurus, and that they'll meet them back at control later. So everybody heads off. And as the Land Rovers are headed back to the visitor center, they see the ship that's leaving the dock off in the distance, and Lex screams that she sees a dinosaur on the side of the ship. Grant is obviously a little bit skeptical of this, so they grab the binoculars out of his vehicle and look at the ship, and sure enough, he verifies that there are 3 little shapes on the outside of the ship. And they decide that they need to get control to have that ship turn around because they know it's headed to the mainland and they can't have dinosaurs getting out there. But as they click on the radio, nothing happens. At this time in the control room, they're also trying to get in contact with everybody via radio, but it's not working. So Arnold goes to pick up the phone to try and call somebody, and there's a loud hissing static sound. Nedry tells him to hang up the phone because that's his data transfer. Everybody gets kind of pissed at Nedry for taking up all the phone lines, but Nedry tells him that he'll be back and it'll be fixed in like 15 minutes. So he leaves to go get a Coke and leaves the room. And very shortly after Nedry leaves the room, all the lights go out. The lights in the park disappear, the video monitors go black, and the Land Cruisers have stopped. The power's out. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the power goes out in the main buildings, but it does cut all of the security systems, and the main fences outside are now also out, which is not really a big concern because at this point the animals have been living with these fences, so they've learned to avoid the static shock that comes with it. However, Muldoon does decide that he wants to go out to the park and make sure that he can get everybody that are in the Land Cruisers and bring them back because he doesn't know how long it's going to take to get the power back, and he decides he'll just take the second gas-powered Jeep that they have, but as he gets down to the garage, he notices that it's gone. Meanwhile, while Muldoon is going down into the garage, Arnold tells security to go and find Dennis Nedry because he needs his help to get the power and the computer systems back on. They come back and they tell him that one of the security guards saw Nedry leaving the garage in the vehicle about 15 minutes ago. Everybody's kind of looking around like, what the hell is going on right now? So since Muldoon can't get the Jeep, he decides to go into action a different way, and he grabs the emergency radios that they have for this kind of situation, but they aren't charged, so he has to give Arnold the charger to plug it in and says, let it charge, and then try to get in touch with the people in the vehicles, let them know what's going on. And he's still not able to reach the Land Cruisers, but he is able to somewhat get through to Harding in a lot of broken radio traffic. He eventually tells him, like, hey, Muldoon needs your Jeep. We need to go out and get the people of the Land Cruisers. You need to come back. Hurry up. While Arnold and Muldoon have been scrambling trying to get these systems back on and get the power back up, Hammond and Dr. Wu have been having dinner in his bungalow discussing a project and an idea that Wu has moving forward. And it's through these conversations that we get a really good understanding of what Hammond's motivations are. You know, Jurassic Park really is made for children. The children of the world love dinosaurs, and the children are going to be absolutely delighted, just delight in this place. Their little faces will shine with the joy of finally seeing these wonderful animals. But I'm afraid I may not live to see it, Henry. I may not live to see the joy on their faces. I think there are other problems too, Wu said, frowning, but no so pressing on my mind as this, that I may not live to see their shining, delighted faces. This is our triumph, this park. We have done what we set out to do. And remember, our original intent was to use the newly emerging technology of genetic engineering to make money. A lot of money. He then goes on to talk with Wu about how using this kind of science for medical research always ends the same way. You end up fighting a bunch of bureaucratic red tape, and your patents are getting denied, and it becomes this really tedious thing, and he kind of ends it with this phrase. So something will happen, your patent application will be denied, your permits will be denied, something will force you to see reason and sell your drug at a lower cost. From a business standpoint, that makes helping mankind a very risky business. Personally, I would never help mankind. And this is exactly where we get really down into the motivation. Like Hammond has said throughout the book, his goal with this was to make money. And we've continually seen where he goes to cut corners in order to make the biggest profit. But this really is where we get just one of the best insights we have into his character. So I'm going to read a little bit more. Now, Hammond said, think how different it is when you're making entertainment. Nobody needs entertainment. That's not a matter of government intervention. If I charge $5,000 a day for my park, who's going to stop me? After all, nobody needs to come here. And far from being highway robbery, a costly price tag actually increases the appeal of the park. A visit becomes a status symbol, and all Americans love that. And so do the Japanese, and of course, they have far more money. That was the original purpose behind pointing my company in this direction in the first place, was to have freedom from government intervention anywhere in the world. We've already leased a large tract in the Ozarks for Jurassic Park Europe, and we long ago obtained an island near Guam for Jurassic Park Japan. Construction on the next 2 Jurassic Parks will begin early next year. They will all be open within 5 years. At that time, direct revenues will exceed $10 billion a year, and merchandising, television, and ancillary rights should double that. And Wu responds to his kind of tirade in this way. I suspect you may find there are other pressures on your park, just as there are pressures on Genetitech's drugs. I can't see how. The scientists may wish to constrain you, even to stop you. Well, they can't do that. He shook his finger at Wu. You know why scientists would try to do that? It's because they want to do research, of course. That's all they ever want to do is research, not to accomplish anything, not to make any progress, just do research. Well, we have a surprise coming for them. I wasn't thinking of that. I'm sure it would be interesting for scientists to do research, but you arrive at the point where these animals are simply too expensive to be used for research. This is wonderful technology, Henry, but it's also frighteningly expensive. The fact is, it can only be supported as entertainment. That's just the way it is. But if there are attempts to shut down... Face the damn facts, Henry! This isn't America. This isn't even Costa Rica. This is my island. I own it. And nothing is going to stop me from opening Jurassic Park to the children of the world. Well, at least the rich ones. And I tell you, they'll love it. As you can see, Hammond is fairly calm when he's talking to Wu, but that's exactly the opposite of how he is when he comes back into the control room and starts screaming at Arnold to get the power back, get the park back online, and to get his grandkids back. And Arnold is basically there like, I'm doing what I can, man. Like, he explains to him that screaming at him isn't going to get anything done, and he kind of sighs and shrugs him off as, like, management people are always like this. They seem to think that screaming is going to get things to happen rather than doing the hard work that he needs to do. So Arnold continues to do his work and decides that since it doesn't seem like Nedry's going to be back anytime soon, he's going to have to go into the coding of the system and try to reset it from there, which is going to take forever. But while Arnold is working on getting the computer system fixed, Harding and Ellie and Gennaro have returned with the Jeep, so Gennaro and Muldoon take it out to go and try to find the people out in the park with the Land Rovers, because it's very apparent that it's going to be a very long time before the system's back online and they can get back. And as we follow them through the park, Gennaro and Muldoon kind of become this, like, ragtag group. They do make a kind of decent team. They just kind of go and start searching the park for the people and surveying what fences need any kind of repairs or if there's anything else wrong in the park. Muldoon is extremely nervous about the fences being down, so he is speeding through the park as fast as he can through the rain and the mud, and as they're going through the park, they see something pale up ahead of them, and as they get closer to it, they realize that it is the stump of a leg. They get out and they go and inspect it and see that it's this pale leg with white socks and brown slip-on shoes. The exact same shoes that Ed Regis was wearing. And Gennaro is understandably a bit freaked out. This is not his line of work. Muldoon is surprisingly calm and is actually given into the idea that they're not really gonna find anything. So he has Gennaro grab the leg and put it in the back of the Jeep, and he does. So they continue down the road and they're kind of chatting, and Muldoon tells him that this was a T-Rex attack because of the ripping that occurred. He kind of tells him that the T-Rex doesn't really bite through things like a lot of animals do now. It actually rips and tears, and that's how he knows that the T-Rex is what got him, but we have no idea how. They continue up the road, and Gennaro is listening to Muldoon as he kind of explains that if Regis has been attacked and is dead, he doesn't really expect to find anything else. He explains to Gennaro that animal attacks really don't have much to discover. Everybody thinks that there's massive trails of blood and this just viscera and guts everywhere, but that's not really the case. Whenever wild animals attack, at least that he's kind of seen, there isn't much evidence left over. And he's afraid that that's what they're gonna find here. And as they come over the hill towards the T-Rex paddock, they notice one of the Land Cruisers is completely on its side. And they see this one, but they're like, where's the other one? They can't find where the other one is, but as they get closer, they see that it's nearly 20 feet off the track and is absolutely smashed and almost unrecognizable. The windshield is completely missing, but there's no shattered glass nearby, and they're just super confused about how it ended up here. So they start investigating, and inside the vehicle, they find a smashed radio, which explains why they couldn't get in contact with anybody. But then they also find a small watch. Muldoon infers that this was Tim's watch and that there's a chance that he's actually alive because there's no damage to the watch other than the face being broken. Gennaro is telling him, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, it obviously got ripped off him, but because there's no damage to the band, Muldoon thinks that the kid noticed that the watch was broken and took it off. So he thinks that they're alive, and he starts kind of treating this like a Sherlock Holmes case. He's looking through the mud and he's finding the tracks, and the hunt guide in him kind of comes out, and he sees 3 sets of tracks, 2 smaller ones and a larger one. So there's at least 2 children and an adult alive, and they keep surveying the area, trying to figure out what else might have happened, and they hear a wheezing sound. And they're not really sure where it's coming from, so they're standing there and they're just listening to the cicadas and the rain, and then they hear it again, this very faint wheezing sound. And they kind of start walking to it, and as they get closer, they discover that it's Malcolm. He's laying on the ground under a bunch of shrubbery, and they kind of move this away from him and realize he'd made a tourniquet for himself and put it on his leg, and that his leg's broken. Doone's worried that he probably has a lot more injuries that they just can't see, so he's afraid to move him, but he decides to put him in the vehicle because he knows if they leave him here, he's absolutely gonna die. So they load him up and head back, and as they're headed back, they just ask themselves, what the hell happened? What happened occurred just as the power went out. The vehicles grind to a halt, and all the bright fluorescent lights that had been bathing the road in this bright light suddenly go off. The world is plummeted into this darkness. It's as if this blanket of darkness is just dropped, with only the sound of the rain in the background pounding against the vehicle. And the rain is so intense that it makes it almost impossible to see out of the vehicles. It's almost like they're parked behind a waterfall that's just cascading over the windows. But luckily for them, Tim found a pair of night vision goggles inside the vehicle, and even though it's still super difficult, he can somewhat see out of the vehicle, and he's looking back at Dr. Grant and Dr. Malcolm, and he can see them even though they can't see him through all the rain. And he has their little 2-way radio, and he's talking to them through it. As Tim is using these night vision goggles, he's kind of sweeping back and forth across the trees and through the plains and everything, and he's not really able to see anything. Suddenly, he thinks he sees something dart across the road, but he misses it. And finally, as they're sitting there, he looks up above the trees, and he sees the T-Rex with its head above the fence, just looking down at them. And he looks down a little bit and realizes that it's holding the fence. And while Tim is talking with Grant and Malcolm about this, Ed Regis is sitting there shaking so violently that his pants sound like a flag in the wind, and he eventually pees himself. And the reason for this is he knows what a dinosaur attack looks like. He has seen the mangled bodies that resulted from a velociraptor attack, and that was a velociraptor. This is a T-Rex. The velociraptor pales in comparison to it. This is the largest carnivore that's ever existed, and in his brain, he's thinking about publications and newspapers that would read about the worst animal attack in history, and as he's thinking about that and all those thoughts flow over him, he opens the door and runs away. It's so dark and it's so rainy that Grant and Malcolm don't see him leave. Tim radios over to them that he left, and they're kind of flabbergasted by this. Like, what do you mean he left? Where did he go? While this is going on and they're talking about this, they hear the rattle of the fence as the T-Rex knocks it over with its hind leg. And Tim is trying frantically to get Lex to close the door, but she's just sitting there repeating over and over, he left us, he left us, he left us. And Tim keeps telling her, Lex, you have to close the door. But she keeps repeating, he left us, he left us. So finally, Tim gets out and closes the door, but the T-Rex sees him, and it gets itself untangled from the fence and starts walking around the vehicle. Tim notices that it's looking into the vehicle, and Grant tells him, don't move, don't make a sound. Just sit there quietly. And they sit there just breathing, watching as the T-Rex looks into the vehicle, turning its head side to side, looking at them with a single eye. But doesn't think that it's seen them, and it goes around. Pretty soon there's a smash as it smashes its head onto the hood of the vehicle, cracking the windshield. It hits it with such force that it jolts Tim and Lex inside the vehicle to where Lex is actually knocked out on the ground in the front seat. And Tim is just sitting there staring at this T-Rex as it shoves its head through the windshield, sending glass everywhere, and then it roars, this blood-curdling roar in Tim's face, and he can smell the death and decay coming from inside its mouth. And he just sits there and he screams because of the pain in his ears, but then he realizes, as the Rex pulls its head out, that it can't get to him. And he notices that it's got some blood on its neck from smashing into the windshield. And as Tim is sitting there thinking about how the Rex can't see him and he can't get its head in, the vehicle rolls onto its side, throwing him against the passenger door. And pretty soon, the vehicle starts raising into the air, and he watches Lex fall through the passenger side front door onto the ground. And he sees that he's 20 feet in the air, and then suddenly the world just starts flying as the vehicle is thrown by the T-Rex off of the road. Now, while all of this is going on, Grant and Malcolm can't really see anything. Again, the rain is so hard and so obstructing their view that they can't really tell what's going on. And at this point, the T-Rex is actually in front of their vehicle, but they don't know it. All they can hear is the rain and the vehicle being smashed and the T-Rex roaring. And at some point, they start to hear screaming, and they think that it's the little girl. And they're sitting there and talking. At one point, Malcolm looks over to Grant and says, "You know, at times like this, one feels, well, perhaps extinct animals should have been left extinct. Don't you have that feeling now?" "Yes," Grant said. He was feeling his heart pounding. Do you, have any suggestions on what we do now?" "I can't think of a thing," Grant said. Malcolm twisted the handle, kicked open the door, and ran. But even as he did, Grant could see he was too late. The Tyrannosaur was too close, and there was another crack of lightning and an instant of glaring white light. Grant watched in horror as the Tyrannosaur roared and leapt forward. Grant doesn't really see exactly what happens, but he just sees Malcolm running in the distance, and the T-Rex runs alongside him and tosses his head, and Malcolm goes flying. Just as this happened, Grant gets out of the vehicle to run, but just as he steps out, the T-Rex whips its head around and is looking right at him. For whatever reason, Grant freezes. He doesn't move. He just stands there, frozen, trying his hardest not to make a sound as the T-Rex comes closer to him and closer, and Grant has all these different thoughts running through his head. He is absolutely freaking out because the largest predator in the world is right in front of him. He's starting to think about this, as a paleontologist, as a scientist, and he starts to think, well, maybe it can't see me. He just stands there as the Rex kind of just goes back and forth, and it's making all these terrifying sounds, and it's roaring at him. And Grant realizes it must know that he's there, but its vision must be based somewhat on movement. So if he doesn't move, it won't find him. And that appears to be right as the T-Rex kind of gets more and more frustrated, and it continues to roar and try to make him move. And finally, in frustration, it kicks the Land Rover, and suddenly Grant feels himself flying through the air because the Land Rover hit him, and he goes flying through the air. He feels himself tumbling over and over, and he kind of just is barely conscious enough to see the ground coming up and smack him in the face. So a lot has happened in the last few minutes, but it still doesn't explain everything that Muldoon finds. Several hours later, he arrives, and there's a leg and no people except Malcolm, which shouldn't be the case based on what happened with the T-Rex attack, where he left all of this destruction and everybody unconscious. But all of that changes when Tim wakes up. When Tim wakes up, he is still inside the Land Cruiser, but he feels like this weird rocking motion, like he's on a boat, and his head is throbbing and he's in pain, and the motion of the vehicle makes him seasick. So he vomits and then kind of gets his bearing about himself and realizes, okay, I'm still in the vehicle, but it's moving. Why? Well, because it's in a tree. He realizes he's 20 feet in the air inside of a tree. And as he's there, kind of trying to figure out what's going on, he sees the Stegosaurus below him, just kind of lumbering around and, takes off. He has no idea how long he's been out, so he looks at his watch, but the face of it's broken, so he takes it off. And he looks at the radio and sees that it's broken, so he can't take that either, but he does still have the night vision goggles that still work, so he takes those with him. So after kind of getting his bearings a little bit, he decides that he's got to get out of this vehicle. He can't sit here being seasick in this vehicle that's not very sturdy. So he gets one of the doors open and he starts to go out of it when the entire thing starts to move a lot more. It becomes even more unstable, and he starts climbing down branch after branch, but realizes that it's not fast enough as he hears cracking of tree branches, and suddenly the vehicle comes plummeting down towards him. So he just lets go and falls like 12 feet onto the ground and does like a power roll to get out of the way of the vehicle. He's leaning against the tree that the vehicle is also leaning against, and the Stegosaurus comes back and he just starts throwing rocks at it, which, like, I know you were just attacked by a dinosaur, so you're probably a little freaked out, but like, why you gotta be so mean? After the Stegosaurus leaves, he grabs the night vision goggles and starts looking around, trying to find anything. He sees that the other Land Rover is messed up and destroyed, but he doesn't see any other dinosaurs around, and he imagines that because the Stegosaurus is around, the T-Rex is probably gone. So he starts looking for his sister, and he eventually does find his sister. She had crawled into a drainage pipe, and she's just sitting there and like rocking back and forth, hitting her head on the pipe. And there's like this really cute moment where he tries to get her to come out with her baseball, and that doesn't work. And she is saying that there's mean animals outside, and he tries to explain to her that they're gone, but that doesn't work. And she asks if her parents are outside, and he's like, no, they're back at home. And she asks if there's any adults around, and he's like, I'm sure they're trying to find us. And that eventually gets her to come out, and it's this sweet little moment between the two. And right after he gets her out of the pipe, Dr. Grant finds him. Oh, thank God, Grant finds the kids, and he gives them a check over to make sure that they're not hurt at all. He's got a bit of an injury. He's kind of tore up from, getting tossed through the air by a freaking T-Rex, but ultimately he doesn't have any life-threatening injuries, and neither do the kids. So they're kind of looking around, trying to see if they can find anybody else, and they can't really, but they come over this little hill, and they look down, and they see Ed Regis in the distance, and he's kind of walking towards them, and as he's walking, all of the sounds of the jungle just stop. And Regis presses himself up against a tree as the juvenile T-Rex comes waddling down the road. It's obviously not as big as the other one, but it's still like 8 or 10 feet tall. Like, it's still a large animal. Lumbers through and goes past, and pretty soon the sounds of the jungle start to come back. They're hearing the cicadas and the other animals, and Regis kind of relaxes and he starts walking when all of a sudden the juvie T-Rex jumps on him, and it pins him to the ground, and he obviously is absolutely terrified, and he starts punching it in the nose, trying to get it off of him, which it works, and he yells at it like it's a stupid animal, and the whole time he's like screaming and yelling and punching the thing. It just kind of looks at him with like the most confused look. He gets up and he starts to walk again, and pretty soon the T-Rex jumps and knocks him over a second time. And this time he's pissed and he's like screaming at it, calling it a stupid animal. Grant and the kids are all watching this, and finally he gets up a second time and the T-Rex jumps on him again. This time it must have broken his leg because he starts screaming, and then the T-Rex bends over and all of a sudden the screaming stops. And it picks its head up and has blood and ragged pieces of flesh hanging from its mouth. And Grant and the kids see this. Tim drops the night vision goggles, which make a sound on the ground, and the T-Rex jolts its head up and looks at them, and they take off into the jungle. As they take off, they eventually come to a field that they believe is in the T-Rex paddock. It was kind of through the fence that had been knocked down, and Grant starts carrying Lex as they're walking through this, and Tim is talking with him, and he's pretty sure that they're in the T-Rex paddock, and Grant's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure we are too. And they have this kind of neat exchange where Tim kind of tells Grant about their family issues and how his parents are getting a divorce and how his dad never really supported any of the thoughts and ideas that he had. He wanted Tim to be into sports, which, Lex does, but he doesn't really support what Tim wants. And he talks to Grant about whether or not Grant is getting married, and he asks if Grant and Ellie are getting married, which Grant's like, no, she's my student. There's a bit of an age gap here. And we learn here that Grant's wife had actually passed away, and Tim tells Grant, like, I'm probably never going to get married, and Grant's like, yeah, me either. Like, just the strangest little conversation between these two, but that's one of the things that I wish they had left in the film. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about the film much, but this really bothers me that they made Grant somebody who doesn't like kids when in the novel he explicitly likes kids. He really enjoys talking to Tim, and even though this conversation is really weird to him, he still likes the kid. He likes talking to him, and he now has this responsibility for him that he's okay with. He doesn't feel forced into it, and that's something that I think we lost in the film. Eventually, they do make it to the edge of the T-Rex paddock. They climb over the fence and they cross the moat, and they eventually make it to a maintenance shed with a bunch of food, and that's on like the service road. So they finally lay down there and go to sleep. Shortly after, Grant wakes up and there's bright fluorescent lights, which means the power's back on. Yeah, that's right. John Arnold, with the power of chain-smoking cigarettes and computer mumbo-jumbo that I don't want to get into, is able to get the power back on. What this means is that the lights are back on, and surely the fences are going to be right behind them. So they start up the computer system, and Arnold starts tracking the movement of animals, and he specifically starts looking for Grant and the kids. While Arnold is trying to get that figured out, Malcolm is telling the story of the T-Rex attack, and that the T-Rex actually picked him up by the torso and shook him before throwing him. And while he's telling him this, Harding, Muldoon, and Gennaro head out to start recovering animals. And they kind of split up. Muldoon is kind of supervising the fixing of a couple of fences that were knocked down by a tree. And while he's doing that, one of the workers points out what he thinks looks like headlights up on a hill in the distance. And Muldoon's like, well, yeah, I'll worry about that later. I need to get these fences fixed. I'll figure that out at a different time. While this is going on, Hammond is talking with Harding and supervising him getting the animals that escaped into different pens back, and it's just the most micromanaging BS there is. Hammond is screaming at Harding that he's hurting the animals and that he's putting too much tranquilizer in them, when Harding is the actual veterinarian, the person who is actually in charge of doing all this stuff. And Hammond is just screaming at him that he's not being gentle enough with a multi-ton animal. And Harding's just like, I don't care. If you want this up and running, let me do my job. Eventually, everybody kind of gets back to control after repairing the fences and getting a bunch of the animals back. Hammond tells Muldoon that he needs to go get the T-Rex and find it. And Muldoon's like, no, there's no way I'm doing that in the night. This is an animal that is too big, too violent. We've seen what it can do. I'm not doing that until morning. And Hammond is pissed and starts screaming at him about getting the T-Rex back. And that's really where things kind of stand until dawn. Grant and the kids wake up and they start making their way towards the visitor center when they come up to a shed. And in that shed, they find a bunch of ores. They find a tranquilizer gun and a map of the whole facility that shows that there's a river that they're really close to that runs within half a mile of the visitor center. So it's decided that they're going to try to take the river. First thing is, they have to find a raft. And they see down the road from the shed that they're in is the lagoon with another shed on top of this little outcropping that goes into the lagoon. And on the side of it, it says raft storage. So they start making their way down there on this little service road, and they start hearing this rhythmic snorting sound, like just a loud exhale through the nose. And they don't really think much of it. And then they start to hear flies buzzing around, just it gets louder and louder the further they go down the road. And then they see 40 yards away from them, the T-Rex is sleeping next to a freshly killed hadrosaur that it had killed and started to eat. They very quietly and very calmly work their way into the shed, and they find the rubber rafts. So Grant pulls one of the rafts out of the shed, and he sets it on this little dock that they have, and he pulls this pin to inflate it, and it inflates with insert classical sound of a rubber raft inflating. Just, they sit there, but the T-Rex doesn't wake up. Okay. So they get in the raft and they push off very, very silently into the lagoon, and they're working their way across it when all of a sudden Lex coughs, and it sounds like a gunshot going across this lagoon. They sit and they wait a second, and they're staring at the dinosaur, and it kind of shakes a little bit and scratches at something. Nothing really happens. Crisis averted. And then she coughs again. I told you, she causes so many issues in this story. This time, the T-Rex yawns and shakes its head and wakes up. And almost immediately, it starts walking into the lagoon. And Grant starts thinking, it can probably swim, but then realizes it doesn't need to, because it can just walk on the bottom of the lagoon like it's a freaking hippo. And it gets further and further down into the water until it looks like a giant alligator. And while all this is going on, Tim and Lex start bickering and screaming at one another, because Tim's obviously pissed that she coughed, but she's like, I couldn't help it. I had a tickle in my throat. Just little kid behavior. I mean, Tim's like 11, Lex is younger than he is. But while they're arguing, Grant is like, shut up, I gotta do my stuff. And he's rowing as hard as he can, trying to get them away from the T-Rex, lunges at them, and it almost hits the raft. Grant's like, oh God, why won't this thing leave me alone? He just goes faster and faster, but after the T-Rex lunges at them, its head goes under the water, and he's still just rowing and rowing, and then suddenly it picks its head up and hits the raft and causes it to spin in the lagoon, and they're pretty sure it's gonna eat them, and as it roars at the raft, Grant shoots it in the cheek with the tranquilizer dart, which really only serves to piss it off more, so it tries to lunge again, but then they hear a roar from the distance off on the shore, and they see that the juvenile T-Rex is now at the dinosaur kill that the T-Rex had and is starting to steal it. So the T-Rex immediately wheels around and goes to chase it off, and it chases the juvenile off into the jungle, and they just hear it roar, and as it runs away, Grant collapses from all the exhaustion and effort he'd put in rowing, and they slowly start to float down the river. While Grant and the kids are floating down the river, Gennaro and Muldoon are back out in the Jeep looking for the T-Rex, and they're discussing it and how it can outrun their Jeep, and that it doesn't really attack the way that a lot of animals do now, where it has this immense bite force, rather that it just grabs you and with its neck muscles just rips you apart. And as they're talking about this, they see a T-Rex kill, and that's what spurs on this conversation. And while they're kind of talking about that, they get contacted over the radio by Arnold, who tells them that they found the Jeep that Nedry stole. They found it on the camera, and they give him the coordinates, and they start headed that way. And as they're rolling up, they see the body of Dennis Nedry lying next to the Jeep, and it is green. It's just covered in green, but as they get closer, he realizes that it's the compies that are scavenging on him. They've established at this point that the compies are scavengers that only really go after already dead animals. So as they get closer, the compies kind of scatter away, and they see the carnage of his death, and it is not pretty. They find him laying on his back. His face is just red, puffy, and swollen, and his eyes are like a bloodshot red. And as they look further down his body, they see that his intestines are completely eviscerated and ripped out. And they also find that his leg looks to have been chewed on by a larger predator. And as they're sitting there looking at this, Gennaro is absolutely disgusted. But Muldoon, who has hated Nedry from the beginning, is basically like, maybe there's some justice in the world, which is like hardcore to see that kind of body and be like, he deserved it. But as they're kind of looking at this, Muldoon points out that there's these dark blotches covering Nedry's shirt and on his face. And Muldoon points out it must have been the Dilophosaur that got him, because that's what the Dilophosaur poison looks like. He kind of explains in his like Sherlock Holmes way, it's like that he must have taken a wrong turn and that he was attacked by the Dilophosaur, who spit on him, which blinded him, and then basically walked up to him and with its like long claws that it has just sliced him open. Muldoon doesn't really care. Gennaro's obviously kind of queasy by this. This is not his line of work, but Muldoon just steps over his body, grabs a rocket launcher and some tranquilizer rockets that were in the Jeep, gets back in his own Jeep, and takes off, leaving his body to be eaten by the compies, which is like coldest thing ever. I cannot do this anymore with this leather jacket. It is too warm, so off with it goes. Still gonna keep the black shirt though, because at this point Malcolm probably doesn't have his leather jacket on either, so I'll just go with the shirt. As Muldoon and Gennaro continue to drive around the park looking for the T-Rex, Arnold radios him again that he's found him on the cameras. He is currently by the river trying to get through the foliage that kind of lines it, and as they are getting near it, Muldoon, first off, it points out that Muldoon finishes a bottle of whiskey and tosses it in the back. Just, not saying it's right, but classic hunter behavior. While they're driving, he starts to prep his launcher and has Gennaro get these needles, which the tranquilizer that they're using, it says the needles are like the size of a finger, which is like, that's impressive. That's a very large needle. And Muldoon explains to Gennaro that they have to use 5 times the amount of tranquilizer that they would use on an elephant, and that the reason for that is partially due to the weight, because the T-Rex weighs upwards of 8 to 10 tons, but also temperament. The T-Rex, being the angry thing that it is, requires a ton of tranquilizer. As they're going and they prep it, they see the T-Rex off in the distance, and they pull up within 50 yards of it, which a 20-foot tall animal at 50 yards, that's really close. That would be terrifyingly close to this, and Gennaro recognizes that, but Muldoon, whether because he's kind of drunk or he's just ballsy, doesn't really care. and he gets out of the vehicle with the rocket launcher for the tranquilizer and has Gennaro get in the driver's seat. Muldoon kneels down to shoot at this dinosaur, and he's like, I'm gonna aim right behind its head. And he gets up and he gets the launcher, and they see it go, and nothing happens. He must have missed. And again, classic Hunter, he starts cursing his sights, blames that the laser sight doesn't have a battery, and that's why he missed. So he tells Gennaro to quick find the battery, but he can't find it. So Gennaro reloads as the T-Rex starts charging at him, and he shoots a second time, and again, nothing happens. So he runs and he jumps into the Jeep as they speed off, and the T-Rex roars in the background. And Gennaro starts giving him crap about missing. Muldoon's like, nah, I didn't miss it. It must have just not worked. And Gennaro's like, nah, I'm pretty sure you missed, buddy. Again, this is like the weird like hunting story in the middle of this animal horror story that I just absolutely love about this book. As they drive back to the visitor center, the T-Rex finally gives up the chase and lets out one final roar. As Grant and the kids are continuing to float down the river, they can hear the T-Rex roaring in the distance, somewhere through the trees. And they've been floating for some time. They actually do end up going through the aviary where the pterodactyls are. There's a brief attack there, but I don't really want to get into that. Read the book. They also go past the Dilophosaurus, which they recognize from all the hooting sounds. And fortunately, none of them spit poison on them. And as they're going through the river, they start to notice that they're moving faster and faster and faster. And pretty soon they realize why. There's a waterfall, and Grant starts paddling back against the current, doing everything that he can to stop the raft, and finally he just shoves the oar into the dirt at the bottom of the river, barely stops them as they come up to the lip of the waterfall. And as they look over, they see this bubbling pool of water as it falls into the bottom, and standing right there in the water is the T-Rex. And again, Grant's doing everything that he can to stop them from going over, but it doesn't work, and eventually they tumble out. The raft kicks all of them out, and Grant falls into the pool of water, and as he's going through the rushing bubbles, he bumps into the side of the T-Rex, and he continues down. Finally, he bursts out of the water and swims over to the side, and he sees Tim coming down the water as well. So he grabs him and hauls him onto the side. As they look back, they see in the T-Rex's jaws is Lexi's life vest. Shortly after they realize this, they actually see Lex floating down the river, only she's face down. So Grant kind of swims out and grabs her and pulls her on the shore, and she's just gray color. And right as he goes to do mouth to mouth, she vomits up water and wakes up and just says in the cutest way, "We did it," which is like, she's annoying, but that's cute. I'll give her that. After this, they start to see little white pieces of foam show up because the T-Rex is tearing apart the life preserver, and while it's distracted, they decide to climb up behind the waterfall. And when they get behind the waterfall, they actually see that there's like an indentation and a bunch of machinery there. Like, it's like this secret access panel. It's like video games always taught me, look behind the waterfall. There's bound to be something back there. And it's inside the maintenance area. Grant actually finds like a secret door that he gets open, but as he gets through it, it closes, separating him from the kids. Goes down further into the maintenance area and sees that there's a vehicle. And as he's kind of looking around, trying to make sure that they can get out of here, he hears a snarling sound, and he turns and just shoots his tranquilizer gun that direction. And he sees that he's tranked a couple-month-old or maybe a year-old juvenile velociraptor. While this is going on, he's on one side of the wall, the kids are on the other, and they're hearing the waterfall, and all of a sudden, they smell garbage again, and suddenly the T-Rex's head shoves through the waterfall and starts roaring at them, trying to get to them, and they scream and try to get as far away from it as they can. It takes its head out, just sits there, and then it pushes its head back through the waterfall again, only this time it doesn't roar, it just opens its mouth and extends its tongue out, trying to feel for them. And as it does this, it touches Lex's leg and then works its way up until it wraps around Tim's face, and he's just trying to hold it away from him, but it's so tight around him that he can't talk, and it starts to pull him towards the T-Rex's mouth, and Lex is like screaming, grabbing onto him, trying to pull her brother away from it. He can't say anything, but he's trying to fight it. He gets right to where he's almost to the T-Rex's teeth when suddenly The tongue relaxes, it falls from Tim's face, and then the T-Rex's mouth clamps down on its tongue, spraying blood everywhere, and then the head falls out of the waterfall, and they just hear a splash below. It turns out Muldoon had actually hit the T-Rex with the tranquilizer. It just took a little while for it to take effect, and the T-Rex is now unconscious at the bottom of the waterfall. Pretty shortly after that, the waterfall stops. Tim notices that the waterfall must run on some sort of power because as the waterfall stops, all the machinery that's been in this room has also stopped, and he realizes this at the exact same time that Arnold and Wu realize it in the control room. They learn that they've actually been running on auxiliary power since the power came on. They never kicked the main power back on, and what that means is, if you remember, one of the things that Arnold had an issue with is that when running on auxiliary power, the security systems don't come back on, and that means that the fences aren't on. And Muldoon realizes this, and realizes that for the last 5 hours that they've been running on auxiliary power, the electrical fences have been down, and that means the raptor fence. And just as he realizes this, he hears somebody scream. Muldoon goes right back into his hunter survival mode, and he goes around and he's handing out radios and he's giving people jobs on what to do. He tells Hammond to go to the lodge. He tells Arnold that he's going to go to the maintenance shed to get the main power back on. Gennaro is going to come with him to take care of the raptors, and we get a really badass line from Muldoon. Context of this, Hammond is, again, still, even in this situation, not happy with the idea that something is going to happen to the dinosaurs or that he might hurt them. So Hammond asks, "What are you going to do to my animals?" And Muldoon responds, "It's not really the question, Mr. Hammond. The question is, what are they going to do to us?" Which is like, first off, true, but also like kind of badass of like, you know, I don't really care what happens to them. I'm worried about what they're going to do to us, and I'm going to do whatever I can to prevent it. You're not really in charge anymore. And with that, Muldoon grabs a rocket launcher and some cylinders out of his cabinet, gives them to Gennaro, and they head out to go hunt the raptors. And as they get out there, they see Arnold at the door of the maintenance shed, surrounded by 3 raptors. And Arnold has grabbed a stick, like that's gonna do anything, and as he's like swinging and the raptors are approaching him, one of them just suddenly explodes because Muldoon shoots it with a rocket launcher. Then he looks at Gennaro and says, "Reload, let's go." But at this point, everyone splits up, and in the novel, the perspectives are changing like every page. So I'm just gonna go through what happens to each person because it's a lot to keep track of. After Muldoon blows up the one raptor, the others start chasing after them, and at one point he falls down an embankment and injures his ankle. This separates him from Gennaro, so he's only got 1 shot left in the launcher, and as he's running away, he eventually finds a pile of drainage pipes that were being used for construction and crawls into one. And while he's in there, the raptors are like circling around him, trying to figure out how they can attack him. After he sees one of them through the pipe, he shoots the leg off of that one. He like is mad at himself because he didn't wait and shoot it in the head. But he's talking on the radio to everybody, just squeezed into this pipe, which is just a funny visual. I kind of wish we'd had that in the film. Next, we follow Arnold. After the one raptor was killed by Muldoon, he actually makes it into the maintenance shed to start restoring power, but he realizes because there's no auxiliary power, there's no lights and it's too dark in there, so he props the door open enough to get some light and uses his shoe to keep it open. He starts walking along the catwalk down towards where the power generators are when suddenly it's dark again, and he looks back up and realizes the reason it's dark is there's a velociraptor blocking the doorway. He quickly scurries down a set of stairs in order to get to the main power. He looks up and sees the velociraptor again. He kind of like congratulates himself for outsmarting the animal because he's like, yeah, there's no way it's going to be able to come down the stairs. So he starts walking towards the generators again when he just hears a thud behind him, turns around and sees that the velociraptor had just jumped down. And before he's even able to run or scream, the velociraptor jumps on him and plunges its claws into his chest, killing him. After getting split up from Muldoon, Gennaro just runs into the forest, and while he's running through there, he realizes that he's not being chased, and he decides to go back to the maintenance shed. For some reason, he leaves his radio behind after making that decision. He says he's gonna go, and then tells everybody on the radio, but Then he doesn't have his radio when he gets to the shed, and there's not really any explanation as to why. But he gets down to the shed, and he's walking along the catwalk, and he feels something warm on his back, and he realizes that there is blood dripping down onto him. The raptor jumps down to attack him, and it's biting his hand. Although it's like injured and doesn't kill him, it picks him up and throws him off the catwalk. And we don't hear about him for a while. All of this is going on at the same time, and everyone's talking through the radios, and Ian, Malcolm, Ellie, and Hammond are all in the lodge listening to this. And this is where he delivers what I think is maybe his greatest monologue of the entire book, and I wanted to read it in its entirety. Hammond came into the room and said, "How is he?" "He's holding," Harding said. "A bit delirious." "I'm nothing of the sort. I'm utterly clear." They listened to the radio. "It sounds like a war out there." "The raptors got out." "Did they?" Breathing shallowly, he continued. "How could that possibly happen?" "It was a system screw-up. Arnold didn't realize the auxiliary power was on and the fences cut out." "Did they?" "Go to hell, you bastard." "If I remember, I predicted fence integrity would fail." Hammond sighed and sat down heavily. "Damn it all," he said, shaking his head. "It must surely not have escaped your notice that at heart we were attempting here is an extremely simple idea. My colleagues and I determined several years ago that it was possible to collect DNA of an extinct animal and to grow it. That seemed like a wonderful idea. It was a kind of time travel, the only time travel in the world. Bring them back alive, so to speak. And since it was so exciting, and since it was so possible to do it, we decided to go forward. We got this island, and we proceeded. It was all very simple." "Simple?" Malcolm said. Somehow he found the energy to sit up in bed. "Simple? You're a bigger fool than I thought you were, and I thought you were a very substantial fool." Ellie said, "Dr. Malcolm," and tried to ease him back down, but Malcolm would have none of it. He pointed toward the radio and all the shouts and cries. "What is that going on out there?" he said. "That's your simple idea." "Simple? You create new life forms, about which you know nothing at all. Your Dr. Wu does not even know the names of the creatures he's creating. He cannot be bothered with such details as what the thing is called, let alone what it is. You create many of them in a very short time. You never learn anything about them, yet you expect them to do your bidding because you made them, and you therefore think you own them. You forget that they are alive. They have intelligence of their own, and they may not do your bidding, and you forget how little you know about them. How incompetent you are to do things you do so frivolously and call them simple. Dear God." He sank back, coughing. "You know what's wrong with scientific power? It's a form of inherited wealth. And you know what assholes continually rich people are. It never fails." "What are you talking about?" "I will tell you what I'm talking about. Most kinds of power require substantial sacrifice by whoever wants the power. There is an apprenticeship, a discipline lasting many years. Whatever kind of power you want, president of a company, black belt in karate, spiritual guru, whatever you seek, you have to put in the time, the practice, the effort. You must give up a lot to get it. It has to be very important to you, and once you attain it, it is your power. It can't be given away, it resides with you. It is literally the result of your discipline." Now, what is interesting about this process is, by the time someone has acquired the ability to kill with his bare hands, he has also matured to the point where he won't use it unwisely. So that kind of power has a built-in control. The discipline of getting the power changes you so that you won't abuse it. But scientific power is like inherited wealth, attained without discipline. You read what others have done, and you make the next step. You can do it very young. You can make progress very fast. There's no discipline lasting many decades. There is no mastery. Old scientists are ignored. There's no humility before nature. There is only a get-rich-quick, make-a-name-for-yourself philosophy. Cheat, lie, falsify, it doesn't matter. Not to you or to your colleagues. No one will criticize you. No one has any standards. They are all trying to do the same thing, to do something big and do it fast. And because you can stand on the shoulders of giants, you can accomplish something quickly. You don't even know exactly what you have done, but already you have reported it, patented it, and sold it. And the buyer will have even less discipline than you. The buyer simply purchases the power, like a commodity. The buyer doesn't even conceive that any discipline might be necessary. "Do you have any idea what he's talking about?" Hammond said. "I haven't a clue. I'll make it simple. A karate master does not kill people with his bare hands. He does not lose his temper and kill his wife. The person who kills is the person who has no discipline, no restraint. The person who kills is the person who has purchased his power in the form of a Saturday night special. And that is the kind of power that science fosters and permits. And that's why you think that to build a place like this is simple." "It was simple," Hammond insisted. "Then why did it go wrong?" They listened to more and more of the radio traffic between Muldoon and Dr. Wu before Malcolm continues his rant. "You know what we were really talking about here? And this attempt at control, we're talking about Western attitudes that are 500 years old. They began at the time when Florence, Italy was the most important city in the world. The basic idea of science, that there was a new way to look at reality, that there was an objective, and that did not depend on your beliefs or your nationality. That was rational. That idea was fresh and exciting back then. It offered promise and hope for the future, and it swept away the old medieval system, which was hundreds of years old. The medieval world of feudal politics and religious dogma and hateful superstitions fell before science. But in truth, this was because the medieval world didn't really work anymore. It didn't work economically, it didn't work intellectually, and it didn't fit the new world that was emerging. But now, science is the belief system that is hundreds of years old. And like the medieval system before it, science is starting not to fit the world anymore. Science has attained so much power that its practical limits begin to be apparent. Largely through science, billions of us live on one small world, densely packed and intercommunicating. But science cannot help us decide what to do with that world or how to live. Science can make a nuclear reactor, but it cannot tell us not to build it. Science can make a pesticide, but it cannot tell us not to use it. And our world starts to become more and more polluted in fundamental ways, air, water, and land, all because of ungovernable science. This much is obvious to everyone. And now, chaos theory proves the unpredictability is built into our lives. It is mundane as the rainstorm we cannot predict. And so the grand vision of science, hundreds of years old, the dream of total control has died in our century, and with it much of the justification, the rationale for science to do what it does, and for us to listen to it. Science has always said that it may not know everything now, but it will know eventually. But now we see that isn't true. It is an idle boast, as foolish and as misguided as a child who jumps off a building because he believes he can fly. We are witnessing the end of the scientific era. Science, like other outmodeled systems, is destroying itself. As it gains its power, it proves itself incapable of handling that power, because things are going very fast now. 50 years ago, everyone was gaga over the atomic bomb. That was power. No one could imagine anything more. Yet a bare decade after the bomb, we began to have genetic power, and genetic power is far more potent than the atomic power. And that will be in everybody's hands. It will be in kits for backyard gardeners, experiments for school children, cheap labs for terrorists and dictators, and that will force everyone to ask the same question. What should I do with this power? Which is the very question science itself cannot answer. So what will happen? Ellie said. A change. What kind of change? All major changes are like death. You can't see to the other side until you are there. This poor man, Hammond said, shaking his head. Malcolm sighed. Do you have any idea how unlikely it is that you or any of us will get off this island alive? And that ends what I believe is one of the greatest monologues in this genre of fiction. But it's not the end of the story. As Malcolm is delivering this kind of undressing tirade against Hammond, Grant and the kids have finally made it back to the visitor center with the juvenile velociraptor, which they put in a cage in the garage that they come to. And as they make their way into the visitor center, they see the carnage and destruction of the raptors getting out. There's broken glass everywhere. There's displays that had been so proudly erected earlier in the novel that are now in tatters on the floor. And they see a couple of the security guards have been killed. While going through the visitor center, Grant eventually gets a hold of a radio, and he makes contact with everybody else. Muldoon, Harding, Malcolm, and Ellie create this plan to distract the raptors so that Grant can make it to the maintenance shed and get the power on, because it's still not on. With this, Grant decides to leave the kids in the cafeteria, and he tells them to stay there while he goes off to the maintenance shed. And while he's doing that, Ellie and Muldoon go outside to distract the raptors. They go to the raptor pen that we saw earlier. Muldoon starts hitting the fence with a piece of rebar, trying to get their attention, and they see one raptor off in the distance, and it's kind of running back and forth. So Muldoon's like, well, we got their attention, that's good. It's not enough for Ellie because there's 5 raptors at this point. So she actually opens the gate to the raptor pen, thinking that the raptors will recognize the sound as, oh, it's feeding time. She opens the gate and starts walking into their paddock, just very slowly walking through, and there's such a heavy mist there that she doesn't take more than 20 steps. The fence behind her has disappeared. She can't see it. And she keeps walking, and as she's walking, a velociraptor lunges right in front of her, and she turns around and runs to get out of the fence, and she's running as fast as she can, and there's velociraptors jumping, trying to get to her, and she just jumps, and Muldoon grabs her and pulls her through the rest of the fence and slams it closed, and the 3 velociraptors hit the fence. So they've got those 3 at least distracted. While this is happening, Grant gets down into the maintenance shed and he's talking to Wu on the radio, who gives him instructions, and he gets the main generator back on. And he finds Gennaro down there hiding in a truck, and he explains what happened to him, but Grant doesn't really buy it. He kind of thinks Gennaro's a bit of a coward at this point, something that we see a little bit more of later on. While Grant's getting the power on and Muldoon and Ellie are distracting the 3 raptors, at least one raptor ends up in the cafeteria. And Tim and Lex are there in the cafeteria, and they start to see the head of one bobbing in between the tables. So they make their way into the kitchen, and Tim tells Lex to stay down and to hide, and he goes into the freezer and grabs steaks, and he starts setting them on the ground in a trail back into the freezer. And he finally goes over to where Lex is, and he's watching the raptor, and it walks up to one steak and just eats it in one bite, one gulp. Tim's like, okay, it's working. The raptor starts walking and makes it to the second steak, and it sniffs it, but then it keeps moving on. Tim wonders if it doesn't like the taste of beef. He's still watching it, and he keeps walking, and it keeps going, and eventually it actually goes into the freezer, and he bodies the door to close it on the dinosaur. And while he's holding the door, the raptor is kind of hitting against it, trying to get the door open, and he screams at Lex to put the pin through the door, but he remembers that she doesn't have the night vision goggles, so she can't see anything, and she's constantly putting it in the door upside down, and it just falls out. So finally he grabs it, pushes it through, and they've locked it in the freezer, and they run off to try to get to the control room. Back inside the lodge, Dr. Wu is watching Ellie and Muldoon distract the 3 raptors that are behind the fence, and he's starting to think about how the idea of them breeding constitutes an amazing piece of his work. Even though it's not what his goal was, the fact that he created an animal, an extinct animal that could reproduce itself, was proof that he might be the greatest scientist in the world. And as he's thinking about this, Harding comes in the room and tells him, hey, we got to get the other 2 inside. And Wu kind of looks at him like, why? And Harding tells him that the raptors that were previously on the roof trying to chew through the bars in the window, like I mentioned with Grant's room earlier, had left. So Wu throws the door open, and he's screaming at Ellie to get inside. And she's like, why? This is working. He's like, no, you need to get inside right now. And as he's screaming at him, he gets knocked out of the door as one of the raptors had jumped from the roof and tackled him, and it slits him open and starts eating his intestines while he's alive. And Ellie screams, Muldoon is freaking out and trying to get her back inside, and Wu is laying on the ground, and he just very lightly tries to push the dinosaur's head away, but it obviously doesn't work, and that's the end of Dr. Wu. So Muldoon runs inside, but Ellie has taken off in an opposite direction. She gets to a tree that she starts climbing, trying to get onto the roof now that the raptors aren't there. And she climbs this tree, and she gets up on the roof, and she looks down and sees that the raptors had followed her up the tree. And she goes and tries to get in through this door, but it's locked. So she decides, screw it, I'm gonna try to jump in the pool. And she runs across the entire roof, jumps, and lands in the pool. Success. But she's pretty sure that since she did it, the raptors are gonna be able to do it too. So she gets out and eventually makes it in through another door that Muldoon opened. Now everybody's inside. Now that everybody's inside, we can breathe a sigh of relief, right? Not exactly. Tim and Lex are able to make it into control, and they start working with the computer, and they see the cameras on the boat that they had seen the raptors on, and they see that it's almost to the mainland. So they are freaking out. They've got to make contact with this boat. As they're doing that, they realize that the raptors have made it inside and are in the hallway outside of control. As Tim and Lex had left to see this, they accidentally get locked outside of control because the main power's been turned back on, which means the security is back on and they don't have a key. So they're scrambling around, they're trying to hide from the velociraptors that are now inside the building, and they see a dead guard on the ground. They grab a security card and start going through doors, and Tim and Lex make it to the nursery where the juvenile raptor is, and it starts jumping on their back and trying to be like held and show affection. And while this is happening, they realize that they didn't close the door all the way. So the adults make it into the nursery, and Tim and Lex, thinking that they would care for the juvenile, throw it at the adults, and shortly after it gets over there, the adults rip it to pieces. So, not a great plan. And just as they think that the adults are going to come after them and attack them, they open the next door and run into Grant and Gennaro. Grant tells Gennaro to take the kids and get them back to control because he has an idea. Grant makes his way into the hatchery, and he makes his way towards the back of the room where Tim had earlier seen the skull and crossbones, and Wu had explained that they had some of the deadliest poisons in the world stored there. Grant makes his way back there and has like the most subtle gearing up hero moment I've seen. He grabs 3 syringes that have these poisons in them and he pulls the caps off with his teeth. And then the novel says he had devoted his whole life to studying dinosaurs. Now he would see how much he really knew, which is like really subtle, badass line about what he's about to do. And Grant thinks to himself, they had kind of thought and assumed that raptors kind of worked as scavengers as well as main predators, and that one of the things they would do is eat other dinosaur eggs. And he's about to put that to the test. So he takes the syringes with him and slowly starts working his way into the nursery towards one of the beds with eggs on it. Then he takes one of his needles and he injects the egg with it and then rolls it towards one of the raptors that is making its way through the room. And it like rolls right next to the raptor and it does nothing. Damn it. He grabs another egg and tries it again. Nothing. Come on. He's getting frustrated. The raptors are getting closer to him. So finally, he injects the third one, and he finally puts some stank on rolling the egg like it's a bowling ball, and because it rolls so much faster, the raptor's instinct kicks in, and it chases it down, and it bites it, and it starts eating it. Grant's like, yes, it worked. Except as it finishes eating it, it sees him, and it starts running towards him, and after it takes a couple strides, it stops and starts convulsing. Pretty soon, it starts foaming at the mouth and kicking in wild directions, and then it finally lands on the ground. 1 down, 2 to go. While this one is on the ground convulsing and foaming at the mouth, or another one walks up to it and is like almost confused as to what's going on. It's never seen one of its fellow animals do this, and sticking with the cannibalism theory, I guess, it bites the struggling one in the leg. Out of its like delirium, that dinosaur bites this one in the neck. So Grant's like, okay, 2 down. As he's watching this, the one pulls away from the other one that bit it and sees him again. So Grant rolls another egg. Again, puts some effort into it. The dinosaur chases it, grabs it, and bites it, and almost immediately starts convulsing and foaming at the mouth again. However, when it does this, it starts kicking and kicks over a bunch of the tables that have eggs on them. So there's eggs spread out all over the room, and Grant's not going to be able to do this anymore. So he thinks really quickly, and he clicks on his radio, and he talks to Ellie and tells her, just start talking. And then he throws his radio across the room. The dinosaur kind of ignores it. Nothing's happening. Grant's pissed because Ellie's not listening. And then she starts talking. The raptor starts making its way over to the radio, and as it does this, Grant stabs it in the tail and injects his final syringe. This obviously catches the dinosaur's attention, and it wheels around and makes its way to attack him, and it jumps and lunges at him, and the first time nicks his shoulder and injures him. He kind of tries to get away, and it lunges at him a second time, but it misses because he kind of tucks and rolls, and then it goes to jump at him a third time, and as it's lifting its leg, it falls backwards and starts convulsing just like the other 2, and with that, the third and final raptor is dead. Gennaro comes in and helps Grant get up and carries them into control, where they can finally get to work on restoring the park. With that, Grant and Gennaro make it back into control, where Tim is currently looking at a video monitor of the boat, getting ready to dock on the mainland and trying to get the phones to go through. And he finally is able to get a phone call to go through, and he tries to talk to the captain, who basically ignores him because he thinks it's a prank call because Tim is a kid. And Gennaro, not having it, finally having his own moment, grabs the phone and threatens to revoke the captain's license if he does not turn around and head back to the island. It works, and they see the boat on the video monitor start pulling away from the docking area and heading back towards the island. So one of their tasks that they had but long before the T-Rex attack has finally been achieved. Now they have to work on achieving another one. At this time, it's now well into the afternoon. They've calculated that there are a total of 8 people dead and currently 6 missing. With the phone system now back up, they were able to call over to San Jose and contact the Costa Rican National Guard, who is currently sending helicopters to blow up the island. The boat crew that they contact had discovered 3 juvenile velociraptors on board and were swiftly able to kill all of them. Because the fences have been down, they start to see on the video monitors velociraptors and the T-Rex, and all of the dinosaurs are starting to intermingle, and they kind of say that it's finally reaching equilibrium. Even though it's not what they wanted, it is actually reaching somewhat of a natural existence. And after making all these phone calls and making all these discoveries, Grant and Muldoon and Ellie start making a plan to actually go out and search for the dinosaur nests, and Gennaro gives them a ton of pushback, saying that they need to just let the National Guard take care of it. They're gonna blow it up anyway, so all of them are gonna die. What's it matter? Grant is of the firm opinion that they need to find out how many animals have actually bred in the wild before destroying it to make sure that all the animals are still on the island. Gennaro, again, is just pushing back and telling him to let the professionals handle it. And finally, Grant snaps. Leave it to the experts, Gennaro said. Grant remembered how he had found Gennaro just 6 hours earlier, huddled and terrified in the cab of a truck in the maintenance building, and suddenly he lost his temper and slammed the lawyer against the concrete wall. "Listen, you little bastard, you have a responsibility to this situation and you better start living up to it." "I am," Gennaro said, coughing. "No, you're not. You've shirked your responsibility all along, from the very beginning. You sold investors on an undertaking you didn't fully understand. You were part owner of a business you failed to supervise and did not check the activities of a man who you knew from experience to be a liar, and you permitted that man to screw around with the most dangerous technology in human history. I'd say you shirked your responsibilities." After this outburst, Grant lets Gennaro go, and he's sitting there coughing, trying his best to catch his breath, and Muldoon and Ellie and Grant kind of just look at him like, "You better get on board because you're going with us whether you like it or not." They set out to go and find the nests. As they're working their way down to get a vehicle, they actually go through a previously unknown part of the maintenance shed that Muldoon wasn't even aware of, and in there they find nerve gas grenades, like hundreds of them, along with gas masks. Hammond had a contingency but failed to tell anybody about it. Muldoon then grabs one of his tracker collars that they've had. They were set up earlier, I just didn't bring them up. And they place it on the juvenile raptor that they then let go in the hopes that it will take them back to the nest. And it takes off into the jungle, and with their little tracking device and their Jeep, they head off after it. The dinosaur starts leading them towards the southern part of the island where more of the volcanic activity is taking place. They find where the dinosaur nest actually is, and they start climbing through basically this tunnel in the earth that's barely big enough for a person to fit through. And Gennaro starts to get cold feet again, but Grant reminds him, "Your money helped create them. Your efforts helped create them. They're your creation. You can't just kill them because you're nervous now." Which, again, is just more proving that Grant is like the most responsible person in this entire story. So Grant and Ellie go down in the hole, and again, Gennaro tries to get cold feet, and Muldoon basically forces him by saying, "You know, you can either go down there or I'm gonna zap you with this electric gun." So he agrees, and they go down, and they find that the nest is actually in this like giant open man-made structure. They're not really sure what it's for, and they find at least 30 raptors. They find 6 adults that are in mating pairs, a ton of juveniles, and then a couple hatchlings. And they notice that in this like cave and nest, they are like lining up, not really understanding what exactly they're doing. Gennaro takes out his watch, which has a compass on it, and he notices that they're either facing northeast or southwest, which again doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to anybody, but they keep watching them, and the juveniles start to kind of squeak and make these noises, and then pretty soon all the raptors just take off running down this tunnel. While the others are in the nest, Hammond, Harding, and Malcolm are still in the lodge. And, well, Malcolm is basically in a coma. He starts moaning what everybody kind of thinks is nonsense, and there's a stench in the room of rotting human flesh. It's the smell of him already starting to decompose, even though he's still alive. And Hammond can't stand the smell, so he decides to go get some air and walks out of the building. And as he walks, he starts thinking, and he's thinking about all of the employees that he had and all the failures that have come out of this. And he just starts dissing all of his employees in his mind. He thinks about how Wu was super sloppy and was too worried about making improvements rather than making live animals. This whole thing was mostly Wu's fault because he created them, which, okay. He says that Arnold was a bad choice because he was constantly worried, and because he was constantly worried about everything, he had missed really important details, but that the two of them had both lacked in vision. They didn't have the vision to see the park, to imagine the kids and the adults coming and being filled with wonder, and that the next time he does this, he's going to make sure he hires people who have that. He starts thinking about Ed Regis was a bad choice too, and Muldoon's a drunk, so he's obviously a bad choice. And again, he just decides he's going to hire better people next time, because that's what led to the downfall of this. Just, he's continuing to avoid seeing any of the truth in what's going on. As he's walking and thinking to himself, he passes a construction worker who nods to him as the founder of this company, and he doesn't even return the nod. He is thinking negatively of the construction workers too, like they didn't do a good job either. Just looking down his nose at everybody, even in the middle of this chaos. As he's walking and he's lost in his thoughts, he hears the T-Rex roar in the distance, and he falls down on the road. He sees the construction worker that he just failed to acknowledge run off into the distance, and he thinks he sees the shadow of the juvenile T-Rex, so he stands up, and after hearing the roar again, he just runs off into the jungle. And he's running, and pretty soon he starts to feel a slant downhill, but he can't stop himself, and he eventually tumbles and he falls into a little creek. And as he goes to get up and start walking back, he realizes that his ankle is broken, and he just starts shouting for help. And he's shouting for help, hoping that somebody will hear him. And as Hammond is out there shouting for help, Malcolm is inside, his voice barely a whisper. His fever has skyrocketed at this point, and Harding is pretty sure he's going to die because he's slipping into this terminal delirium. He doesn't think he's going to make it to the ambulance helicopter that they've called for him, and Malcolm starts talking about paradigm shifts, and Harding isn't really sure what he's talking about, and Malcolm says that he doesn't care, and Harding asks him about what, and his response is anything, because everything looks different on the other side. And with that, he cracks a smile across his face and succumbs to his injuries, dying there in the lodge with the sound of the T-Rex roaring in the distance. The T-Rex roar that Hammond can still hear as he's down the hill. And then after the roar, he hears Tim and Lex laughing and joking with one another, and he realizes that the roar that he was hearing was being played over a loudspeaker outside of the control room, and that Tim and Lex were messing with it. And at this point, he becomes absolutely furious. He starts cursing the fact that the kids are even there in the first place, even though it was his decision to bring them there, and he curses them like, damn these kids, they should have never been on this island. I only brought them here to piss off Gennaro and keep him from shutting this down. He starts climbing the hill with one leg, just hopping up the hill, and as he's hopping up the hill, he hears this squeaking sound in the distance coming from up the hill, and as he looks up, he sees one of the compies start hopping down the hill, and pretty soon it's joined by a large group of them, which doesn't make a lot of sense to him because compies are scavengers. They only go after things that are already dead. But he doesn't really think much of it, and he continues up the hill, and they continue following him to the point where he grabs a branch and starts swinging it at him to get him to go away, but they just kind of stand off at a distance, not really caring what he's doing. He finally grabs a rock and chucks it at one, hitting it in the chest, and that gets him to back up a fair amount. He kind of thinks good of himself and continues up the hill. And as he's continuing to hobble, he feels a light pressure on his back, and then bite in the back of his neck. One of the compies had jumped on his back and bit him, and immediately he starts to feel a sort of numb warmth start to wash over him, and he grabs the compy and throws it off of his back. But as he'd done that, it bit him in the hand, and he starts to feel even more of that warmth, and he just starts feeling tired. So he sits down on the ground and he lays back against the hill, and he just feels this numbness and this warmth wash over his entire body. And one of the compies finally jumps on his chest, and he's staring there looking at it, not feeling anything. He doesn't even feel its feet on top of him as it starts biting him in the neck, and he just continues to feel this pleasure and this warmth wash over him as the compies continue to bite at him over and over and over again. And with that, the founder of the park is killed. Grant, Ellie, and Gennaro are now running after the raptors down this tunnel, following them, when suddenly it opens up bright and they're on a beach. And they get out on this beach and they notice that they're lined up just like they had been inside the tunnel, but now they're more uniformly spaced, with the adults equally spaced and juveniles grouping around them. They almost look like a military formation. They watch and they wonder, and Grant's thinking about it, and he's thinking about how we had originally thought that dinosaurs were more like lizards, but in fact they were more like birds. And as he has that realization, he realizes they're acting like birds because they want to migrate. As he starts talking with Ellie about the realization that they're trying to migrate because they're like birds, a helicopter suddenly appears over them and starts to land, and the raptors all scatter, and the helicopter lands and grabs all three of them and pulls them on board, and they see that Muldoon and the two kids are already in the helicopter, and one of the Costa Rican military members asks Grant if he's in charge, and he's like, I have no idea who's in charge. While everybody's getting settled in the helicopter, Muldoon catches Grant up on everything that's been happening. He tells him that Harding and some of the other construction workers were on another helicopter, and he tells him that sadly Malcolm has passed away. And Grant asks him, well, what about Hammond? Muldoon's only response is, the compies got him. And Grant sits down, they look out and see all these helicopters taking off from the island, and he starts to see some of the dinosaurs running around, and he sees the juvenile T-Rex with a fresh kill. And as he sees them, he starts to see bright lights of fire and flame as bombs are dropped across the entire island. And they fly off towards the mainland, and the island is left as nothing but this burning ember as the sun starts to go down. Several days later, Grant is sitting by the pool in a hotel room thinking about everything that the last couple days had entailed. He had been shuffled from government building to government building, asked to tell his story over and over again, and nobody's really wanting to let them leave because they had this disaster happen in an island that Costa Rica technically owned, and nobody knew anything about this. So they're not really keen on letting anybody leave, and as he's sitting there at the pool watching the kids play in the water, a man walks up to him and introduces himself as Marty Gutierrez. Grant recognizes him as the man who had sent forth the Compy sample at the very beginning of this story. He tells Grant that the government has been tracking a weird phenomenon that's been happening where a unknown group of animals is eating crops like soybeans and chickens in almost a straight line southwest. And Grant thinks about it for a moment, and he realizes that the plants and the animals that are being eaten are high in lysine. And he looks at Gutierrez, and Gutierrez asks him, "They're traveling almost like a migration, wouldn't you say?" And Grant nods his head. With that, Dr. Gutierrez tells him to enjoy his stay in the country, that it's a beautiful place, and Grant is super confused, wondering why he's not allowed to leave, and he kind of asks Gutierrez this, and Gutierrez responds, "None of us are going anywhere," and he smiles and walks back into the hotel, leaving Grant by the pool after having this knowing conversation, and the novel ends, leaving them there, stuck in Costa Rica, thus concluding Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. What an amazing novel. I mean, very obviously love this book. This is a book that, I'll get into it, but had a pretty significant impact on me as a person and what I wanted to do with my life. Which sounds really weird when it's a horror story about dinosaurs getting out. But one of the reasons that I wanted to make this was, one, I have such a love for the novel, and two, I think that the films kind of did a disservice to the book, especially what the films eventually became, which I'll talk about a little bit. Everybody thinks Jurassic Park and they think of the film, and the theme that it conveys is, oh, we shouldn't create dinosaurs. We shouldn't create these long extinct animals, which is true. We probably shouldn't, but that's not the point of the novel. That's kind of just the skin that Crichton puts on the novel to express his point. And his point is that we shouldn't just create technology because we can. That's Malcolm's whole point when he gives that speech to Hammond of like, you didn't earn any of this. Technological advance is this kind of inherited wealth. You did nothing to earn it, and then you stand on the shoulders of giants who did earn it. In that speech, Malcolm talks about things going faster and faster, and technology advancing faster and faster. I'm pretty sure it's Moore's Law that says every year technology gets twice as advanced at half the cost. Something like that. I learned about it in electronics school. But that's his point, is with technology advancing so much, if there aren't safeguards, and if there aren't people who are willing to actually be disciplined about how they use and create technology, it is going to lead to problems like this. It's something that, like, Crichton sets up in the very beginning of the book. It's not even in the actual book itself. It's just an introduction. Biotechnology promises the greatest revolution in human history, but biotechnology revolution differs in three important respects from past scientific information. First is that it's broad-based. Second is much of the research is thoughtless or frivolous. And third is that the work is uncontrolled and no one supervises it. But the most disturbing is that there are no watchdogs found among the scientists themselves. Meaning that in this world that he's talking about, and I think we can see in our world now, there is nobody on the inside who is willing to say, no, we shouldn't be creating this thing. We shouldn't be pushing technology in this realm without understanding it. The internet has been around for decades now, and we are just now starting to understand some of the repercussions of using technology like this. And the whole thing in the book is the reason that this thing fails is not only just that there are complexities in a system that you can't control, but they take technology that is brand new, that they hardly understand. They have to hire somebody completely outside of their system and not tell them what this system is being used for in order to create the computer system that they use. And they rely on automation, a computer system that is brand new, that they don't have an understanding for how to operate or fix. There's a point in here when Tim is trying to get the computers back up and running, and he radios to somebody and is like, hey, you work at the park, tell me how this works. And there's a long silence, and Muldoon says, none of us know how to do that. The novel mentions that Tim has seen complex systems before, but there's usually like cheat sheets or instructions on how to do it. And there's nothing here because they're so confident that it's always going to work that they don't need those things. And that reliance on that technology and the reliance on the technology of creating these dinosaurs is the downfall of all of this. And like, how often do we do that now? We created the internet and now we base almost everything on it. Books. I read physical books, but I have books on my iPad. I have books on my phone. I have access to so much information. Is just at the palm of my hand. We base our entire society on this thing. How many times do we see news things where it's like, oh, there's been a data breach of 500,000 social security numbers, and we're just like, oh yeah, that's fine. The systems that we base our entire society and how we function, how we financially function, we base it on this system that we don't even truly understand. We just created it, we patented it, and we sold it. That's Malcolm's point. We found the new technology and we're so enamored with what it could do that we didn't think about whether or not we should do it. And that's really the point that I think gets missed in the films and like later iterations of the films. Oh my gosh. Like, there's one good Jurassic Park movie, and I said in my story, like, Malcolm dies here because that's how it is in the book. This book stands alone. Sure, he writes a sequel and he retcons this information, but no, in this story, Malcolm is dead. And that's how I view it. And like, it's such a shame because it's such a well-written novel. And like, the first movie is well-written. I'm not disparaging that first movie at all. It just doesn't convey the message the way that the novel does so well. The movies eventually became the thing that the book warns about. Oh, we can make it, so we're going to, right? The most recent films they're not written well, first off. But secondly, they use computer-generated technology, a technology that, although it's not new in terms of like time frame, it's been around for a couple decades. On the broad scale of technology, it's extremely new, and they use it to make, oh, well, we just wanted more dinosaurs. We wanted bigger and better things, and they went for the, oh my gosh, we got to see dinosaurs walking on film, which was something that had never been done before the first movie. They took that and said, okay, that's what these movies are about. They completely gutted the soul of this franchise, and now they bring back Dr. Malcolm, who is, in this novel, is like the in person. He's Crichton's stand-in. The person who delivers all the themes of the novel is Malcolm, hence why I dress like him for this video. They took him and now he's just there in the films, and they still try to use him as a prophet, but it's so poorly written, and I'm so sad whenever I hear, oh, there's another Jurassic Park movie coming, and I'm like, oh, great. Are they ever going to actually convey the themes of this book? The themes that made this book so good. It's so depressing. And like, when I thought about making this video, I was like, oh, I could go the AI route where AI technology is becoming so advanced. And now it's like, ooh, again, it's this broad-based thing. How many AI companies are there now? Google has their own AI. Twitter has their own AI. OpenAI is a thing. ChatGPT, all these things. It's just open. And like, now we have military applications that we're going to be using AI for, which is like, I don't know, the whole theme of a different piece of fiction that, maybe we should be thinking about. But we're offloading human thought and stuff. I saw an ad that infuriates me so much every time I think about it. It was an ad for an AI inside of a phone, and it says, oh, when you've lost your phone or somebody texts you asking if you're on the way to meet up with them, tell your phone to text them that you lost your phone or that you dropped your phone in the couch, but you have them do that in the voice of Shakespeare. And I'm like, Ian Malcolm was right, and so was Teddy. Like, why does this exist? It used to be that in order to write something like Shakespeare, you had to read Shakespeare. You had to understand what it is that made Shakespeare great. And that's Malcolm's point. We stand on these shoulders of giants, and because we have the technology to do it, we don't even think about what the consequences could be. And I know I talked about it in the actual plot synopsis, but I wanted to reiterate the line that had the biggest effect on me as a person when I first read this. I first read the Jurassic Park novel when I was in high school, and I had spent probably 3 or 4 years taking a bunch of engineering classes, and I've always been fascinated with aerospace engineering and stuff. And I was like, oh man, that'd be really cool. So I was like, man, that'd be really cool to do. So I was putting in all this effort to learn how to be an engineer because I was like, oh, I want to be a weapons engineer because that's so freaking cool. Like, I have a love for the military, and I just thought that was so awesome, and that's what I wanted to do. And then I read this novel, and I read this line, and it completely changed the trajectory of my life. Science cannot help us decide what to do with the world or how to live. Science can make a nuclear reactor, but it cannot tell us not to build it. Science can make pesticides, but cannot tell us not to use it. And our world starts to seem polluted in fundamental ways, air, water, and land, because of ungovernable science. That line basically made me flush 4 years of time away. I stopped having the desire to become an engineer, and that actually made me, or helped influence me in wanting to join the military, not to like harm people, but I wanted to help people. And I realized, like, through reading that, if I went and became like a weapons technology engineer, I could build the thing, but I couldn't tell anybody not to use it. And that didn't sit right with me. The idea that I could create a technology that people who would not have any of the discipline, right? Malcolm talks about earlier, like when the person who buys it, they don't even realize that discipline is needed in order to handle a technology. Like, that idea shook me so much that I completely left the idea of becoming an engineer purely because of that line. The fact that it had such an impact on me is part of what makes me sad to see it not used, or people not talking about those themes and those messages from this book. I just hope that, I hope that me kind of reading this and telling this story can kind of help people realize that there's so much more to this story, and that we kind of right now are in a place where maybe we need to understand the actual meaning of this novel. Because, like Malcolm says, a change has to happen. Whether or not we are willing to actually make an impact and make the change is up to us. He also talks about, like, we're not damaging the world. Like, the world has survived so many things, and it's certainly going to survive us. It's about whether or not we survive. And as things continue to get further and further down the road, I'm not so sure that the trajectory we're on leads to that outcome. And I think that reading stories like this and letting them actually have that deep impact on us can actually help us to maybe move forward in a better way. Maybe we don't look at a technology that we could create and say, yeah, we need to create it, without first considering what the consequences are. That's really why Malcolm is my favorite character in this novel, because he's the one character who he's never swayed by the technology. When they first see the dinosaurs, he is still making jokes, asking if they're animatronic. Meanwhile, everybody else is so completely blown away. Like, Ellie is just repeating the words, "my God," over and over again. Grant starts laughing and can almost not contain himself. Gennaro has no words to say because they're all awestruck by this technology. But Malcolm, the one who from the beginning realized that this was a problem and that this reliance on technology was not going to be good, he's the one who saw it from the beginning, and he never sways from that idea. And it's for that reason that I think he's the best character. If you know the end of your journey, you can see whether or not a action now will actually take you closer to that end or further away from that end. For that reason, that's why I think Malcolm kind of has that characteristic. He can see what the conclusion of this technology is, and he knows that it's not good, so he warns them from the very beginning, you shouldn't do this. You should not have done this. But they did it anyway. And the only thing that he can do is sit back and watch. And unfortunately, he becomes a victim of the very ignorance that he warned against. That's the tragedy of him as a character, I think. He gets swept up in all of this, and he ends up losing his life because of a technology that he knew from the very beginning was wrong and shouldn't have been built. Another theme that's touched on a ton in the book that I didn't go into as much, there's like a famous scene from the novel that was not in the films where the compies actually kill and start eating an infant in a hospital room. I didn't include it because I do think that it kind of makes the narrative a little hard to follow sometimes, or I don't know. I just didn't include it. But there's like this constant theme of the technology overtaking and affecting kids. So we have Tim and Lex, the two main child characters in this show, or in this novel, that are affected by the technology. They're the first ones that get attacked by the T-Rex. It's this unbridled technology that they created and used, attacking and harming the kids. And the first story that I told of Dr. Gutierrez coming in and examining a little girl who was attacked. And then you have the little infant story, and there's all these stories or mentions in the novel of attacks happening on little kids. It's interesting because it really is that it's kids who are affected by a new technology first. When we first have the internet, like, sure, it's not as widely used, but as soon as it becomes widely used it starts to affect kids. You have kids nowadays, like an iPad baby is a meme now because it affects children so much. And we're starting to see the side effects of having unfettered access to the internet at such a young age. Oh, yeah, well, the internet's not great for adults too if you have unfettered access. And that's true. But as an adult, you at least have some safeguards to stop this from happening. When you're a little kid, it comes and it's an overwhelming force and there's nothing you can do. Just like the T-Rex in The Attack, or just like the Compy on the beach. It's a force that the kids have no way to stand up to, and it's the adults that force this technology onto them. And there's also a strange bit of irony in this novel in that Michael Crichton created this book as a warning against unfettered technological advance, right? That, I mean, we've gone over it. That's the theme of the book. Why dinosaurs? Why did he use somebody creating a park of dinosaurs as kind of the skin or the narrative structure around this story? Is it because, well, yeah, I mean, dinosaurs are obviously able to kill people, but there's a lot of animals throughout history that were able to kill people. It's for the same reason that John Hammond created dinosaurs. It's the same reason that John decided dinosaurs are what he was going to put this technology to, because dinosaurs were popular, because they were cool, because he knew that he could inspire wonder by using dinosaurs, real life dinosaurs. And Crichton did it for the same reason. He used the thing that was popular to tell his story and warning. And it just makes me wonder if, like, you know, I'm sitting here kind of railing against the internet, but I'm using the internet to deliver the story that I'm telling. It's this weird thing of having to use the technology that you are warning against in order to make that warning. And I just wonder if that's how it's going to continue down the line, is we just use the technology that we don't like and that we think is bad in order to deliver the message that that technology is bad. And the story would kind of end here, except I opened my phone the other day and went, oh, look, more man-made horrors beyond my comprehension. Very recently, a company called Colossal released a press release that said they had de-extinct dire wolves. Man, you really didn't listen, did you? There's been a bunch of press about how this company has brought dire wolves back from extinction and that they genetically modified a gray wolf to actually be a dire wolf, which is actually not true at all. They edited, like, I think it's something like 15 genes, which is like, okay, this is 99.99999% gray wolf. You have a genetically modified gray wolf, but you're calling it a dire wolf. Maybe not the best idea considering what everybody gets from Jurassic Park, which is don't bring these animals back. And like, there's absolutely a theme of that. Like, where are you going to put a dire wolf? If it is a real dire wolf, like, where are you going to put it? There's no ecosystem that exists for the dire wolf to just slot into. They released this video stating about how they did it and what the technology is. And it's like, okay, cool, sciencey stuff. But then there's a woman, and I don't mean to disparage this person. She's probably just making talking points of the business, but she says everybody thinks that we're doing Jurassic Park and that's not what we're doing. And my response was just, what an odd thing to say, because if you actually read the novel and understand the themes of the book, that's exactly what you did. It's like, no, that's exactly what you did. You did a Jurassic Park because you supposedly created an animal that has no natural ecosystem to go back to. If this is, which it's not, a full dire wolf, it would be just like Malcolm said, the air is different, the food is different, the plants are different, the UV exposure is different. Everything is different about the world from when that animal existed. So these dire wolves that they created can only exist in isolation in a park setting. There's no place for them to put them in the wild. So you did exactly a Jurassic Park in that sense, but you also did a Jurassic Park in why did you choose a dire wolf? Right? There's probably plenty of species. We always see these news releases of like, oh, this recently extinct animal, we can't have this animal anymore because it's recently gone extinct. If it's recently gone extinct, there's probably plenty of DNA of it out in the world. Go find it and bring it back. But no, you used a dire wolf because you wanted to get a picture of George R.R. Martin with dire wolf puppies because it's cool, because it's popular, and because you can look at your shareholders and say, look what we did. We created this cool thing. Don't you want to pet this puppy? Everybody loves puppies. If it was actually about scientific advancement and actually bringing back animals that we needed in this world, that we thought the world needed to have these creatures, it probably would have been a bird somewhere that nobody's ever heard of. But no, you picked the popular thing, the thing that everybody wants to see. You did exactly what John Hammond did, and then you said, we're not doing Jurassic Park. That's exactly what you're doing. It's like you read the book and said, do that. Do exactly what he does in the novel to a T. Do it. Build a park. We're going to do it. It's going to be great. We're going to make a ton of money. And like, it's exactly the same as when he made the elephant, right? He makes this tiny elephant and says, oh, look at this genetic marvel that we created. When in reality, it's just a genetically modified dwarf elephant. They didn't create a new creature. They just modified and tortured and twisted what was already a real creation. And then they said, no, actually, it's a dire wolf. Look at it. It's amazing. You did it so that you could make money and that so you could... I'm getting frustrated. Oh, I'm getting so unbelievably angry about this because I hate when people say, oh, you know, everybody thinks of this piece of art that's like this warning, and that's not actually what we're doing. And by saying that, they just prove how ignorant they are of the art piece and the warning that it gives. And it's so infuriating because this is new technology that in Michael Crichton's day was like, yeah, genetic engineering was certainly a thing when he wrote this book, but it seems like it was this kind of far outlandish thing. And it's like, it's oh my gosh, it's exactly the conversation that Grant and Malcolm have. Everybody knows it's coming, just not so soon. And when it gets here so soon, we don't know what to do with it. And because we don't know what to do with it, we do whatever we want with it. And we don't temper ourselves, and we create a technology that is going to have consequences that we can't actually foresee. Except Crichton did foresee it because he put it in his book 30 years ago. It's so frustrating to see things like this. Everybody eats it up and says, oh my gosh, how amazing is this technology? Not realizing that, just like Malcolm says, with spending billions of dollars trying to control the weather for it to never work, that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to spend billions of dollars thinking that we can bring back extinct animals when that's actually not what they're doing with the technology. We're going to waste all that money trying to bring back animals instead of focusing on conserving the animals that we have now, which maybe even that isn't like the best idea, because even Malcolm says, like, we like nature how we want it. We simplify it, we dumb it down, and then we screw it up. Okay, maybe that's the thing. We just need to stop using this unfettered power that we have through technology. Like, maybe there's technologies that we have that we should just get rid of, that we shouldn't use because it's harming the environment. And then we see that it's harming in the environment, and we try to do what we can to conserve it. But because we don't understand how complicated of a system the world has been set up to be, we screw it up, and then we end up with things like Yellowstone, where, oh my gosh, the elk are so cool. We need to have so many of these. And then we do what we can to control wolf populations, keep the elk from being killed. And then there's so many elk that are so beautiful and magnificent. And then they eat all the frickin' grass in Yellowstone to where all the other herbivore animals are dying out. And it becomes like this miniature ecological disaster in the middle of a national park. And it's like, okay, yeah, maybe we just shouldn't mess with nature, and we shouldn't mess with technology either. Maybe we should just be okay being a part of nature. The more and more I read of novels like this, and the more and more I see people doing things that these stories from our past warn against, the more I just want to be a hobbit. I just want to live in the dirt. I want to smoke tobacco, and I want to be left alone. I just want to live in the trees and be by myself. That's the whole point of what Tolkien says in that too, is there won't be a Shire if we don't succeed in what we're doing. So I guess I'll just keep reading these terrible stories and seeing people use technology in the way that is horrific and we've been warned about again and again and again. And I guess I'll just keep bringing up these stories and keep being the warning that people may or may not listen to. But if you sat through me telling this story and ranting about all of the themes and everything that just infuriates me about people today, I appreciate you watching this long. Thank you for supporting me. If you have any desire to support me further, you can give to my beer fund, and I'll link all that stuff below. I worry that, maybe people will heed these messages, and we'll have people who will tell these stories and try to warn people, and people might actually listen. Or maybe it's just like he says, where it's coming, everybody just doesn't realize how soon, and we're just kind of like lost to try and fight it. But I don't know. That's a really depressing ending. So yeah, I love this novel. You should read it. It's absolutely fantastic. I went through a lot of stuff in here. Obviously, there's a ton more that I didn't get to. Like, I didn't really go into too much of the corporate greed stuff, but like, I mean, that's really what I see with this like thing with the dire wolves, where it's like, oh yeah, you made the dire wolf because that's cool and popular and will get you clicks, and clicks get you money, and money gets you more research so that you can make more things that attracts more people, and it just becomes this entertainment thing, just what Hammond said. And yeah, I don't know. Don't support the direwolf thing. It's dumb. There's way better uses of technology. Some technology is really amazing and we do really phenomenal things with it. But then I read something like that and I'm just absolutely floored that we would do that. I'm hot. I'm so sweaty in this black clothing, and I'm tired and I need to edit this video. So thank you all for watching. I appreciate you all for being here, and yeah, if you want to support me, everything will be linked down in the description of this video. Thank you. God bless. And yeah, read more stories. The end.